Hello everyone, welcome back to my stream. Tonight we're going to read some more lore, and hopefully we'll read it wholly. Okay, let's start. Alright, we need to read Song of the Return, Volume 19, the second tale of the Ilgirmet. Second. Alright. When that final battle at the Barren Pass was completed and the melting snow carried Elfblood back to the sea, the crew of the Kal Kaz, the Sudden Wraith, and the most exalted crew of our Lord's ship, the Ilgirmet, at last parted ways, never to join shields again. They drew apart in that form which is not a loss, but a gain in knowing one's heart can be carried in the chests of others. So great was the love that those first of the 500 had for each other, and most especially for the great Ysgramor, harbinger of us all. They pressed eastwards, seeking the sea, when they came upon the barrow of Ingol, the mighty Ygramor's son who had fallen to the whims of Kain rather than the treachery of the elves. Wait a sec. Right. Our Lord had not expected to lay eyes upon it again so soon, and his grief followed anew at the sight of it, as a reopened wound will bleed as it did when first received. His eyes turned to the south, where a river met sea, and decreed that there would he and the crew of the Ilgirmet create a great city, in monument to the glories of mankind, that from his palace he might always look upon the hill of his dear son's resting place, and feel that his line would know peace in this new home that was never known in Atmora. The elven captives were set to work, bringing forth stone to build in their conqueror's fashion. As many elves died in the building of the city as had the crew of the Ilgirmet slain while on the way to its site, and Ysgramor drove the wretches evermore to build higher, to lay claim to the river so that none might pass into the interior of his land without first showing due respect to its rightful claimant. Thus was the great bridge constructed, forever striding the river that no elf might sneak through to avenge his devious cousins. As the bridge was built long, so too was the palace built high, spires reaching the sky to show dominion even over the very winds that had brought forth such a grief. In the deep hollows beneath the city, a great tomb was prepared for the day when Lord Ysgramor, harbinger to us all, would be called home to glory in Sovngarde. But as we know, he chose instead to be buried on the shore facing towards Atmora, that though his heart lived and died in this new land, it would forever yearn for the beauties of still green Atmora before the freezing took it. Thus was founding of Windhelm, the city of kings, though her history is long and her glories did not end with her founder. Songs of the Return, Volume 24, the first tale of the Krelot Log. When the time came for breaking off camp, not all crews took southwards across the rolling lands. Some turned with quick eyes back to their ships, for their hearts were bounded to the waves as sure as they were bounded to each other as allied companions. One such crew was that of Krelot Log, sinewy long folk from the eastern edge of Atmora. Their ruddy skin matched the dawn, and it was often said that morning herself learned the glorious colors from the first faces to meet her at the break of day. The great Kain lifted their souls and their winds, propelling them westwards with the new lands of Tamriel ever beckoning to the south. In time, these perpetual wanderers came upon sights fearsome and terrible. Entire kingdoms of men beyond their recognition, skin charred like overcooked meat. Elves, even more devious than the northern betrayers, disgraced their horizons until they learned the sheltered ways between. Yo, Bjorand, glad to see you here. Great deserts, the likes of which were never known in the homeland peopled by beasts that spoke like men with the savagery of elves. Many a notable and well-sung companion met his end at the spears of the legged snakes of the southern marsh. Among the brave crew of the Krelot Loch were of Roeth and Breath the Elder, the great shield brothers, who often swapped spears, and their war wives, Britta and Grave, the fair child, shield sisters in their own right, who could bring the face of terror across the ice-chilled seas. Together, these four stared into the abyss of trees that formed the foul-smelling homeland of the Snake Men, and as they were blessed at Morans, who feared no shore of Tamriel, they ventured forth to seek out their glories in the most dangerous of these new lands. Onward they flew, ravaging the swamplands, beating a trail between themselves and their ship, such that they would never lose sight of the shore. In the far-off day when at last Royd would fall, when British screamed faint war cries so that all the marshes were emptied, this trail would fill once more with the treacherous Snake Men, so began the burning march of these great captains of us all. I think that camera is acting up on me again. Come on. Yeah, I didn't even do anything. Alright, let's see. Let's see it's restored. Come on, deactivate. And now activate. Well... doesn't want to. Let's do it again. Shall we? Will it liver now? Come on. Let's see yet again. Yes, it's alive! Right, the game didn't glitch, so proceed with our reading. Songs of the Return, Volume 56, The Final Tale of the Creon. The songs of the Return are eternal and numerous. For those first 500, those companions of Ysgramor who cleared the way for mankind's rightful habitation, burned with a fire not seen since those days long past. Each ship carried a crew that performed legendary feats that could feed the pride of any nation for 1,000 years. And during this time of the broadening, scores of companions wandered the land, bringing the light of the proper gods to the heathen lands of elves and beasts. They were but mortal though, and in time all would taste the glories of Sovngarde. It was in one of the uncounted years after the retaking of Southall that the crew of the Creon was declaring their fortunes in the eastern lands near the Red Mountain. They were encamped, surrounded by bodies of murderous elves who had attempted to make them believe they held peace in their hearts. The shrewd Horlak was the Creon's captain, though and would show no quarter to the liars of the Southlands, as had been commanded by his lord Ysgramor, harbinger of us all. It was in this state of carousing that they were approached by a young and breathless messenger of their sister crew from the Khal Khaz. The boy Asgeir, as his name is now sung, had ran unimaginable distance at breakneck speed from the blood-stained fields of the clouded sun to deliver the news to all who would hear. When he reached their camp, he bellowed a great sob before relieving his heart with the news that the mighty Ysgramor had breathed his last. Asgeir continued his swift run to inform the other crews as quickly as they could be found, for there were many now crawling the land, rendering our legacy from their deeds. And the camp of the Creon descended into a mourning of the most forlorn sort. Among those fires sat the bravest men and fiercest women who have ever graced the dirt of this land, and they were brought low by such a nation, such a notion. While we in the dayshine know only Isgramore's glory as it gleams through history, his companions knew his might with their own eyes, and such a loss hangs so heavily on the heart that mere words cannot express the altering of their world. For indeed, the stories tell that Rorlak, the most battle-hardened and unflinching of all captains, did collapse with grief and never lifted again his mighty axe. And all around Tamriel, as the news spread as a dark cloud washes from horizon to horizon, did brilliant lights go out in silent honor of their fallen general and war leader. So ended the period of the return, and the original glories of the 500 companions of Isgramor, harbinger of us all. Right, Dance in Fire and the Poison Song. Book 1, Pristine Cell. It was beginning again. Even though everything seemed serene, the last embers crackling in the hearth, young servant girl and her child slumbered in a chair by the door, a tapestry half finished against the wall, waiting to be completed tomorrow. One of the moons visible through a milky cloud outside the window, a lone bird out of sight in the rafters, cooing placidly. They heard the first chorus of the song strike dissonantly somewhere far away. The bird in the rafters croaked and took flight through the window. The baby in the girl's arms woke and began to scream. The song swelled in intensity, yet still remained subtle and stately in tempo. The movement of everything seemed to take on the rhythm of the music as if strange choreography had been staged. The girl rising to the window, the clouds reflecting back red from the inferno below, her scream all muted, consumed by the song. Everything that came thereafter, Tay had seen so many times it had almost ceased to be a nightmare. He did not remember anything of his life before coming to the island of Gorn, but he understood that there was something different in his past that set him apart from his cousins. It wasn't simply that his parents were dead, but his cousin Bainara's parents had also died in the war, nor were the other housemen on Gorn or nearby Mournhold unusually cruel to him. They treated him with the same polite indifference that any Indoril has for every other 8-year-old boy that got underfoot. But somehow, with absolute certainty, Tay knew he was alone, different, because of a song he always heard and his nightmares. If you're certainly imaginative, his aunt Ulia would smile patiently before waving him away so she could return to her scriptures and chores. Different. Everyone in the world thinks they're different. That's what makes it such a common sentiment, said his older cousin Kelkoreth, who was studying to be temple priest and had a firm grasp on paradoxes. If you tell anyone else that you keep hearing music where there's no music to be heard, they'll call you mad and bury you in the shrine of Shogorath. His uncle Trifith would snarl before striding away to attend his business. Only his nursemaid Edaba would listen to him seriously and just nod with a faint look of pride, but she would never say another word. His cousin and chief playmate, Bainara, was by far the least interested in the stories of his song and his dreams. "How tiresome you are with all this, Tay," said Bainara after luncheon the summer of his eighth year. He, she, and a younger cousin Vaster walked into a clearing in the midst of flowering trees. The grass was very low, barely up to their ankles, and there were big black piles of leaves from the previous autumn. "Now, shall we get back to it? What shall we play?" Tay thought for a moment. "We could play the Siege of Orsinium." "What's that?" asked Yester, their constant companion, 3 years their junior. Orsinium was the home of the orcs, often in the Rothgarian mountains. For hundreds of years it kept growing bigger and bigger and bigger. The orcs would come down out of the mountains and rape and pillage all over High Rock, and then King Jolly of Daggerfall and Gaiden Shinji of the Order of Diagna and someone else, I forget, from Sentinel joined together against Orsinium. For 30 years they fought and fought. Orsinium had walls made out of iron, and try as they might, they couldn't break through. "So what happened?" asked Bainara. "You're so good at making up things that never happened, why don't you make it up?" So they did. Tay was the king of the orcs, perched up in a tree they called Orsinium. Rhaenyra and Vassar played King Joily and Gedin Shinji, and they threw pebbles and sticks up at Tay while he taunted them in his most guttural voice. The three decided that the goddess Kinnereth, played by Rhaenyra in dual role, answered the prayers of Gaiden Shinji and drenched Orsinium in a torrent of rain. The walls rusted and dissolved. On cue, Tay obligingly fell from the tree and let King Joily and Gaiden Shinji mangle him with their enchanted blades. For the most of that summer, the year 675 of the First Era, Tay was nearly insensible by the power of the sun. There were no clouds, but it rained most every night, so the vegetation on the island of Gorn was bewildering lush. The stones themselves seemed to glow with sunlight, and the ditches burned with white meadowsweet and parsley down. All around here were soft smells of flowers and tree untroubled by wind. The foliage was purple-green, blue-green, ash-green, white-green. The wide cupolas, twisting cobbled streets and thatched roofs of the little village of Gorn and massive bleached rock of Sandhill House all were magical to him. Yet the dreams haunted his nights and the song continued whether he was awake or not. Against Aunt Ulia's admonishments, Tay, Rhaenyra and Vaster had breakfast outdoors every morning with the servants. Ulia would hold an interior breakfast for herself and any visiting dignitaries. Guests were rare, so she often ate alone. At first the servants would dine in silence, attempting gentility, but they broke down and would regale the children with gossip, reports, stories and rumors. Poor Arnile is laid up with a fever again. I'm telling you, they're cursed, the whole lot of them. Piss on the fairy and they're piss right back on you. Doesn't little Miss Starcia look, oh, just a wee bit tight around the belly region lately? She's not. The only servant who didn't speak at all was Tay's nursemaid Edba. She wasn't pretty like the other maids, but the scars on her face did not deform her. Her poorly set broken nose and her short hair gave her a certain alien mystique. She would merely quietly smile at the gossip and look at Tay with almost frightening love and devotion. One day after breakfast, Rhaenyra whispered to Tay and Vaster, "We have to go to the hills on the other side of the island." She had used such imperatives before and always had something wonderful to show: a waterfall, tucked away behind ferns and tall rocks, a sunny grove of figs, a discreet still some peasants had set up, a sickly oak twisted into a kneeling human figure, a collapsed stone wall that they imagined was thousands of years old, the last refuge of a doomed princess they named Morella. The three walked across through the forest until they came to a clearing. A few hundred feet beyond, the meadow sank to a dry creek bed filled with small smooth stones. They followed that into the dark woods where trees canopied high over their heads. Sporadic red and yellow blossoms burst along the moist underbrush, but they became rarer and rarer as the children marched on under the umbrageous oaks and elms. The air crackled with birds seeking a staccato, choral piece, a minor chord of the song. Where are we going? Asked Tay. It's not where we're going, it's what we're going to see, replied Rhaenyra. The forest surrounded the three children completely, bathed them in its tenebrous hues, and breathed on them with wet chirrups and sighs. It was easy for them to imagine that they were within a monster, walking along its twisted spines of stones. Rhaenyra scrambled up the steep hill and peered through the thick mass of shrub and tree. Tay lifted Vaster out of the creek bed and climbed out, gripping soft grass for support. There was no path through the forest here. Brambles and low-hanging branches struck at them like the claws of chained beasts. The cries of the birds became ever more stentorious as if angered at the invasion. One limb drew blood on Vaster's cheek, but he didn't cry out. Even Rhaenyra, who could pass like an ethereal creature through impenetrable forests, had braid catch on a bramble, ruining the intricate pattern a servant had woven hours before. She paused to pull out the other braid, so her briefly unruly tresses fell freely behind her. Now she was something wild, a nymph guiding the other two throughout her woodland domain. The song began to beat like a wild pulse. Yo bro, welcome to my channel. They were on a shelf of stone below a cliff overlooking a tremendous gorge. staring over an expanse of cinder. It looked like the scene of a tremendous battle, a holocaust of fire. Charred boxes, weaponry, animal bones, and detritus too annihilated to be identifiable littered the ground. Speechless, Tay and Vaster stepped into the black field. Beinara smiled, proud that she had finally found something of true wonder and mystery. "What is this place?" asked Vaster at last. "I don't know," Beinara shrugged. "I thought at first that it was some kind of ruin, but now I think it's a junk pile. Just now, not like any junk pile I've ever seen. Just look at this stuff." The three began an unorganized survey of the dusty mounds of refuse. Beinara found a twisted sword only lightly blackened by flame and began polishing it to read the inscriptions on the blade. Vaster amused himself by breaking brittle boxes with his hands and feet, imagining himself a giant of unbelievable strength. A battered shield attracted Tay. There was something about it that reverberated with the sound of the song. He pulled it out and wiped its surface clean. "I've never seen that crest before," said Beinara, looking over Ty's shoulder. "I think I have, but I don't remember," Ty whispered, trying to conjure the memory from his dreams. He was sure he had seen it there. "Look at this," Vaster cried, interrupting Tay's thoughts. The boy was holding up a crystal orb, and his hand moved over the surface, brushing away grit and dust. A key in the song rose, which sent a shiver through Tay's entire body. Beinara ran over to look at Vaster's treasure, but Tay felt paralyzed. "Where did you find that?" she gasped, gazing into the swirl beneath the crystal surface. Over in that wagon, Vaster gestured toward a heap of blackened wood, barely discernible from the other piles but for its cart spokes. Beinara began digging into the half-collapsed structure so only her feet could be seen. The song built in potency, sweeping over Tay. He began walking towards Vaster slowly. "Give me that," he whispered in a voice he could barely recognize as his own. "No," Vaster whispered back, his eyes locked on the colors reflected in the heart of the globe. "It's mine." Beinara dug through the remains of the wagon for several more minutes, but she could find no treasures like Vaster's. Most everything within was destroyed, and what remained was commonplace by any standards: broken arrows, armor shards, guar bones. Frustrated, she pulled herself out into the sunlight. Tay was alone, at the edge of the great gorge. "Where's Vaster?" Tay blinked and then turned back to his cousin with a shrug and a grin. He went back to show everyone his new plunder. "Did you find anything interesting?" "Not really," said Beinara. "We probably ought to get back home before Vaster tells them anything that will get us in trouble." Then Beinara started the walk back at a quick pace. Ty knew that Vaster would not be there when they got back. He would never be returning home again. The crystal globe rested snugly in Tay's satchel, hidden under a pile of junk he had picked up. With all his heart he prayed for the song to return and drown out the memory of the gorge and the long silent fall down. The boy had been so surprised he hadn't even time to scream. The Poison Song, Book 2 by Briston Zell. Tay felt no guilt, which frightened him. All through the long, fast walk away from the gorge, through the woods across the dry creek bed, he chatted merrily with Beinara, fully aware that he had just committed murder. Whenever his mind strayed from the conversation and he thought back on the last moments of Vaster's short life, the song would soar. He could not think of the boy's death, but Ty knew he was responsible. "You're a mess," cried Aunt Ulia the moment she saw the two children emerging from the woods onto the grounds of Sandale House. "Where have you been?" "Didn't Vaster already tell you?" asked Tay. The scene played itself out as Tay knew it would, every dancer in the song performing their steps as choreographed. Aunt Ulia saying that she had not seen Vaster, Beinara not yet frightened, making up an innocent lie about the threesome not having strayed far, saying he must have gotten lost. A slow but steady rhythm of panic intensifying as night began to fall, and Vaster had not yet returned. Beinara and Tay cheerfully. He was surprised how easy it was for him to cry without feeling, admitting where they had been and leading Uncle Triffith and a crowd of servants to the junk pile and gorge. The tireless search through the woods as night turned to dawn. The weeping, the light punishment, merely cries of anger that Beinara and Tay suffered for losing their young cousin. It was thought, from their stricken expressions, that the children felt guilty enough. They were sent to bed at dawn while the hunt through the woods continued. Tay was drifting to sleep when his nursemaid Edaba came into his room. The look of unwavering love and devotion had not left her eyes, and he sank gratefully into his dreams and nightmares with her holding his hand. The song wafted almost imperceptibly through his consciousness as he again had the vision of the room in the castle, the girl and her baby, the bird in the rafters, the giant fire, the sudden explosion of violence. Breathless, Tay opened his eyes. Edaba was stealing out the door, softly humming the song to herself. In her hand was the crystal globe from his satchel. For a moment he hesitated about to cry out. How did she know the song? Was she aware that he had murdered another boy to get the globe? Somehow he knew that she was helping him, that she knew all and loved him and sought only to protect him. The next day, and the next week, and the next month were all the same. No one spoke very much, and when they did, it was to suggest new places to look for the missing boy. Everywhere had been searched thoroughly. Tay was curious why they never looked in the gorge, but he understood how inaccessible it was. A side effect of Voster's absence was that the tutorial sessions with Kenna Gafrizi took on a more serious, even academic quality. The younger boy's high spirits and meager attentiveness had always cut the lessons short, but sensible Beinara and quiet Tay were ideal pupils. He was particularly impressed by how focused they became during a rather dry history lecture about the heraldic symbols of Houses of Morrowind. The crest of the Hlalu features a scale, he sniffed disdainfully. They see themselves as the great compromisers, as if they were something honorable. Many hundreds of years ago they were the tribesmen following Resdain who chose— "Pardon me, Kenna," asked Beinara, "but what is the crest with the insect on it?" "You don't know House Redran?" asked the tutor, lifting up one of the shields. "I know you have a sheltered life on Gorn, but you're surely old enough to recognize—" "Not that one, Kenna," replied Tay. "I think she means the other crest with an insect." "I see," nodded Kenna. Gavrizi brow furrowed. "Yes, you would be too young to have ever seen the crest of the Sixth South, the House of Dagoth. Our enemies, together with the accursed heretical Dwemer in the War of the Red Mountain, now totally destroyed, thanks to Lord, Mother and Wizard. That house was a curse on our land for millennia, and when at last their pestilence was snuffed out, the very earth itself breathed a cloud of fire and ash in relief, bringing night to day for over a year's time." Beinara and Tay knew they could not speak, but they exchanged knowing glances at one another as the tutor enlarged on the theme of the great wickedness of the Dwemer and the House Dagoth. As soon as the lesson ended, they walked silently out of Sandal House until they were far from all ears and eyes. The afternoon sun stretched out the shadows of the spear-like trees surrounding the meadow. Off in the distance, they could hear the sounds of the workers beginning their preparations for the autumntide harvest, yelling to one another unintelligibly in coarse and familiar accents. "That was definitely the symbol on that shield you found at the garbage heap," Beinara said at last. "Everything there must be a remnant of the House Dagoth." Tay nodded. His mind was on the strange crystal globe. He felt a light vibration of soundless music touch his body and knew he was discovering new cadence of the song. "Why would our people have burned and discarded all that?" he asked thoughtfully. "Do you think the House Dagoth was so evil that everything associated with them could have been cursed?" Beinara laughed. At the height of day, all talk of curses and the evil Sixth House were pure supposition, something to add romance to one's life, but nothing to worry about. The two children walked back to the castle for yet another in a series of cold, quiet dinners. As the night fell, Beinara looked through the treasures she had picked up in the junk heap. By the light of the moons, the small jars, the torque with orange gemstones, the bits of tarnished silver and gold of no obvious purpose, all took on a sinister aspect. Revulsion overtook her, feeling of admiration instantly. There was strange energy to them, a tincture of death and corruption that was undeniable. Beinara ran to the window and vomited. Looking out to the dark open lawn below, she saw a figure below lighting an arrangement of candles in the shape of a large insect, the symbol of House Dagoth. When it looked in her direction, she pulled back but she saw the face illuminated by the Talos. It was Edaba, Tai's nursemaid. The next morning, Bainara left the castle grounds early, bearing a large sack filled with her treasures. She carried them to the dumping ground and then left them there. Then she returned and told her uncle Trifid what she had seen the night before, leaving out only what had made her sick in the first place. Edema was banished from the Isle of Gorn without discussion. She wept, begging to be allowed to say goodbye to Tay, but all believed that would be too dangerous. When Tay asked what had become of her, he was told that she had to return to her family on the mainland. He had grown too old for a nursemaid. Bainara never told him what she knew, for she was afraid. Wait a second. I need a minute. Well, let's continue, shall we? The Poison Song, Book 3 by Bristin Zell. Tay was 18 in the year 685 of the First Era when he first saw Mournhold, the city of spires, home of the goddess. His cousin Kelkorith, already senior initiate in the temple, gave him a couple of rooms on the ground floor of the house he had purchased. They were small and unfurnished, but bitter green grew outside the windows, and when the wind blew they filled his bedroom with a lovely spicy air. The course of the song did not trouble him anymore. Sometimes he was even unconscious to it, so low and melodic it had become. Occasionally, when he was passing through the streets on the way to the temple for his instruction, someone would pass him and the song would rise in intensity before falling away again. Whatever was different about those people, Tay never tried to ascertain. He remembered the last time he had let the song lead him and called for him to murder his young cousin Vaster. The memory did not trouble him unduly, but he didn't want to hurt anyone again unless he had to. House couriers regularly brought Tay letters from Bainara, still back in Sandale House on the island of Gorn. She might have gone to study at the temple. She was certainly intelligent enough, but she chose not to. In a year or two at most, she would have to leave and assume her place in House Indoril, but she was not in a hurry. Tay welcomed the trivial gossipy news the letters brought and responded back with news of his own studies and romances. In his third month on Mournhold, he had already met a girl. She was also a student at the temple, and her name was Akra. Tay wrote enthusiastically about her to Bainara, describing her as having the mind of Sothasil, the wit of Vivek, and the beauty of Almalexia. Bainara replied back merely that if she had known how blasphemous students of the temple were allowed to be, she might have become an initiate herself. "You are very devoted to your cousin," Akra left when Tay showed her the letter. "Am I looking at the last remains of a thwarted romance?" "She's lovely, but I never thought of her that way," Tay scoffed. "Incest never particularly interested me." "She a very close cousin, then?" Tay thought for a moment. "I don't know. Truthfully, no one spoke much of either her parents or mine, so I really don't know how we were connected. They were casualties of the War of the Red Mountain, that I know, and it seemed to cast rather a pall on the adult's humor whenever we asked about her parents or mine. After a while, we stopped asking. But you're an Indoril too. Perhaps you're a closer cousin to me than Bainara." "Perhaps so," Akra smiled, rising from her chair. She uncoiled her hair. which had been pulled up in the formal arrangement reserved for well-born priestesses. As Tay watched transfigured, she removed the small brooch that fastened her robe to her shoulder cape. The soft silken fabric slipped down slowly, exposing her dark, slender body to him for the first time. "If we are, does incest particularly interest you now?" As they made love, the song began a slow, rhythmic ascension in Tay's head. The vision of Akra before him darkened and was replaced by images from his nightmares before returning again. When finally he collapsed, the room seemed filled with the fire-red cloud of his dreams, and the scream of the woman, her child facing death, echoed in his head. He opened his eyes, and there was Akra smiling at him. Tay kissed her, grateful to have her in his arms. For the next 2 weeks, Tay and Akra were never far apart. Even when they were at study in opposite wings of the temple, Tay thought of her, and somehow knew she was thinking of him. They would rush to be together afterwards, ravishing one another in his rooms every night and in a private corner of the temple garden every day. It was while Tay was rushing to see his beloved one afternoon that the song rose up in powerful strident tones at the approach of an old ragged woman. He closed his eyes and tried to quiet it, but when he looked again at her purchasing cork-bound papers from a street vendor, he knew who she was, his old nursemaid from Gorn, Edaba. She who had abandoned him without even a farewell to join her family on the mainland. She didn't see him, and as she passed down the street, Tay turned and began to follow. They walked through shadowy passageways into the very poorest part of the city, a quarter which was an alien to him as the wildest principality of Akavir. She unlocked a small wooden door on the street without a name, and he finally called out her name. She didn't turn, but when he followed, he found that the door had been left ajar. The chamber was murky and damp like a cave. She stood facing him, her face even more wrinkled than he had remembered it, etched with lines of sorrow. He closed the door behind him, and she took his hand and kissed it. "You're so tall and strong," Edaba said, beginning to weep. "I should have killed myself before I let them take me away from you." "How is your family?" Tay asked coldly. "You are my only family," she whispered. "The Indoril pigs forced me to leave, thrusting their blades in my face. When they discovered that I serve you and your family, not them, that bitch girl Bainara saw me at a prayer of mourning." "You're speaking like a madwoman," Tay sneered. "How could you love me and my family, but hate the House Indoril? I am the House Indoril." "You're old enough to know the truth," Edaba said fiercely. Tay had bitterly joked about her madness, but he saw something close to it burning in her ancient eyes. "You are not born of House Indoril. They brought you into their house after the war, like they and the other houses brought in all the orphans. It was the only way they sought to erase history and remove all traces of their enemies by raising their enemies as one of them." Tay turned toward the door. "I can see why you were taken away from Gorn, old woman. You're delusional." "Wait!" Edaba cried, rushing to a musty cabinet. She retrieved from it a glass globe that shimmered with a spectrum of color even in the chamber's gloom. "Do you remember this? You slew that little boy Vassar because he possessed it, and I took it from your room because you were not ready to face the facts of your inheritance and responsibility then. Did you not wonder why this bauble drew you so?" Tay gasped and though he did not want to, he said, "I hear a song sometimes." "That is the song of your ancestors, of your true family," she said, nodding. "You must not fight it, for it is a song of destiny. It will lead you to do what must be done." "Shut up," Tay howled. "Everything you say is a lie. You're insane." Edaba threw the globe to the ground with all her might, shattering it with a deafening retort. The shards melted into the air. All that was left was a small silver ring, simply wrought with a flat crown. The old woman quietly picked it up and handed it to him, while he stood with his back against the door, trembling. "This is your inheritance as the bearer of the sixth house." The ring's crown was meant for stamping and sealing official house proclamations. They had seen his uncle Triffith's similar ring, crested with the wing, which was the seal of House Indoril. This ring was different, with an insect design which he remembered from the day when Kanaga Freezy had taught the house heraldry to Bainar and him. It was the symbol of the cursed house Dagoth. The song took over all of Tay's senses. He heard its music, smelled its horror, tasted its sadness, felt its power, and the only thing he could see before him was the flames of its destruction. When he took the ring and placed it on his finger, his mind was not aware of what he was doing, nor was Tay aware of anything but the song when he removed his dagger from its sheath and thrust it into his old nursemaid's heart. Tay did not even hear her final words when Edaba fell bleeding to the ground and groaned with a blood-streaked smile, "Thank you." When the veil of the song lifted, Tay did not realize that first he was no longer dreaming. Before him had been flames, the very ones that destroyed the home of his birth, and flames were before him again, but they were flames from a fire he had struck outside the crumbling tenement that were already bursting through walls, consuming the body of his old nursemaid. Tay fled through the streets as people began to call for the guards. The Poison Song, Book 4, by Bristin Zell. Akra sat by the hearth in Tay's room, reading her book by the fire. It concerned some minutiae of theosophy that she did not believe in, but nevertheless found morbidly compelling. When the door opened and she heard Tay enter, she finished the paragraph she was reading before looking up. "I've been here for hours, darling. If I knew you were going to be so late, I would have brought more books," she giggled. When she saw Tay's face and the state of his clothing, her manner lost all frivolity. "What happened to you? Are you alright?" "I've been to see my old childhood nursemaid, Edaba," he said in a strange voice. It was a sudden change of plans. I hadn't realized she was in Moorhold. "I wish I had known where you were going," she said, rising slowly from her chair. "I would have loved to have met her. Well, it's too late now. I've killed her." Akra inhaled deeply, studying Tay's frozen face. She took his hand. "Perhaps you ought to tell me everything." Tay let his beloved lead him to the hearth, where he sat blinking at the fire. He looked down at the silver ring on his finger. "Before I killed her, she gave me this. It's the sealing ring of the House Dagoth. She told me I was the bearer of the inheritance, and the song I hear all the time in my head, the one that called me to kill another boy when I was young, and then Edaba herself, is the song of my ancestors." Tay fell silent. Akra knelt by his side, stroking his ringed hand. "Tell me more." "My tutor Canon Gafrizi taught us that the House Dagoth was a curse on Morrowind. He said that when they were all destroyed at the end of the war, the very earth itself breathed in relief." Tay closed his eyes. "I can see the obliteration. I can even hear it in the song. Edaba told me that the 5 houses adopted the orphan children of Dagoth, raising them in their own traditions. I thought she was mad or a liar, but the real lie was all those years I thought my family was House Indoril." "What are you going to do?" Akra whispered. "Well, Edaba told me to follow the song to my destiny." Tay laughed bitterly. "But the song led me to kill her, so I don't know if she'd still give me that recommendation now. I know that I needed to leave Mournhold. Before I knew what I was doing, I set a fire in her tenement. The guards were called. I just don't know where I'd go." "You have many friends to shield you if you prove yourself to be the new leader of the Return of the Sixth House." Akra kissed the ring. "I will help you find them." Tay stared at her. "Why would you help me? When you thought I was your cousin in House Indoril, you did not mind having me, though it might well have been incestuous." Akra replied, meeting his eyes. "I have heard the song too. It is not as strong with me as it was with you, but I never chose to ignore it. It taught me more than the ridiculous temple priests and priestesses ever could. I knew that my true name was Dagoth Akra, and I knew that I had a brother." "No," Tay said through gritted teeth, "you're lying. You're Dagoth Tython." Tay shoved Akra hard against the wall and ran from the room. As he fled through the hall, he heard the sound of Kelkorith's footfall on the stairs behind him, a percussive instrument in the song that was rising in his heart and head. "Cousin," the senior initiate was saying, "have you heard about the fire?" Tay unsheathed his dagger and turned, burying it to the hilt of Kelkorith's throat. "Cousin," he hissed, "I am not your cousin." The streets of Mournhold were lit by the red glow of the 10-man fire, spreading through the tight alleyways, by a steady and intense gust of wind. It was as if Dagoth Ur himself was looming over the city, fanning the flames his air had struck. A house guard, running toward the blaze, stopped at the sight of Tay, standing uncertainly swaying before the front door of Kelkorith's house. a bloody blade in his hand. "What have you done, Sergio?" There, Tay ran for the forest, his cape whipping behind him by the force of the howling wind. The guard clambered after him, sword drawn. He had no need to investigate the house to see the murder, he knew. For hours, Tay raced through the wilderness, the song pushing him onward. The sound of his pursuer faded away. At last, the trees thinned, and he saw nothing before him but air and water. A cliff 100 feet long plunged into the inner sea. The song told him no. It pulled him north, sweetly promising a place to rest among friends. More than friends, people who would worship him as the heir of Dagoth. As he slowly walked toward the edge of the cliff, the song became more threatening, warning him not to seek to avoid his fate. There was no escaping death. Tay spat a curse upon his house and threw himself head first over the cliff. It was another glorious day on the island of Gorn, and the first one in weeks that Bainara could truly enjoy. Uncle Triffith had important company, housemen from far away, and she had been required to attend every dinner, every meeting, every ceremony. As a child, she remembered she had hoped for some attention. Now nothing was more blissful than a time away from her duties. There was only one thing she wanted to do that she had to do indoors, and that was writing a letter to her cousin. But that could wait until the evening, she told herself. After all, he had not written her in many days. It was the influence of that girl, Akra. Not that she seemed disagreeable, but Bainara knew how one's first love can be all-consuming. At least she had read about it. As she walked idly through the wildflower meadow, Bainara was so distracted with her thoughts that she did not hear her maid Hilima calling. She was quite startled when she turned to see the young servant running up. "Sergio," she said breathlessly, "please come. Someone has washed up on the shore. It's your cousin, Sergio Indorel Tay." The Poison Book. The Poison Song, Book 5, by Bristin Zell. For 2 days, the house healers attended Tay in his bed, and Bainara sat by his side, holding his hand. He was feverish, neither asleep nor awake, screaming at invisible phantoms. The healers complimented the young man's fortitude. Bodies had washed ashore on the island of Gorn several times, many during the war, but never once had they seen one that lived afterwards. Aunt Ulia came in several times to bring Bainara food. "You must be careful, dear, or when he's all well, he'll have to attend you on your sick bed." Tay's fever broke, and at last he was able to open his eyes and see the young woman with whom he had spent 17 years, all but the first year of his life. She smiled at him and called for food. In silence, she helped him eat. "I knew you wouldn't die, cousin," she whispered fondly. "I hoped to, but somehow I knew I wouldn't either." He groaned. "Bainara, do you remember all those nightmares I told you about? They're all true. We can talk about it when you're rested some more." "No," he croaked. "I must tell you everything now, so you'll know what kind of a monster you call your dear cousin Tay. If there was some way you could have known before, you might not have been so eager to see me well again." A tear rolled Bainara's cheek. She had grown into a beauty, even the few months he had been away in Mournhold. "How can you think I would stop loving you no matter what you've done?" I saw my old nursemaid Edaba and spoke to her. "Oh!" Bainara had feared this moment. "Tay, I didn't know what she told you, but it was all my fault. You remember when Kenna Grafisi taught us about the House Dagoth and its corruption? That night I saw your nursemaid making some kind of altar out of the north lawn using the symbol of the 6th house. She must have been doing it for years, but I never knew what it meant. I told Uncle Triffith and he sent her away. I've wanted to tell you so many times now, but I was afraid to. She was so devoted to you." Tay smiled. "And didn't it frighten you even more to wonder if there was any connection between her devotion to me and her devotion to the accursed house? I know you, Bainara. You're not one of those women who doesn't choose to use her mind." "Tay, I don't know what she told you, but I think she was very troubled, and whatever she thought about you and the 6th house was wrong. You have to remember that. The ramblings of one mad woman are proof of nothing. There's more." Tay sighed and held up his hand. For a moment he blinked and then turned to Bainara angrily. "What happened to my ring?" If you saw it, you must have known already that everything I'm saying to you is true. I threw the filthy thing away. Bainara stood up. Tay, I'm going to let you rest now. I have the heir of House Dagoth. Tay was wild-eyed, almost screaming, raised after the war as House Indoril, but driven by the song of my ancestors. When we were young, I killed Vaster because the song told me he had stolen my inheritance. When Edeba told me who I was and gave me this ring, I killed her and burned her house to the ground because the song told me she had served her purpose. When I returned to Calcorith's house, my love was there telling me that she was of House Dagoth too, and my sister. I fled, and when Calcorith tried to stop me, I slew him because the song told me he was an enemy. Tay, stop, Bainara sobbed. I don't believe a word of it. You've been feverish. No, Tay, he shook his head, breathing heavily. The name my parents gave me was Dagoth Tython. You can't have killed Edeba. You loved her, and Vaster and Calcorith, they were our cousins. They were not my true cousins, Tay said coldly. The song told me they were my foes, just as it's telling me now that you're my foe, but I won't listen. I'll keep from listening as long as I can. Bainara fled from the room, slamming the door behind her. She took a key from her startled maid Hilima and secured the lock. Sergio Indoril Bainara, Hilima whispered with great sympathy. Is all well with your cousin, Sergio Indoril Tay? He'll be perfectly fine once he rests. Bainara recovered her dignity, wiping the tears from her face. No one is to disturb him under any circumstances. I'll take the key with me. Now I have much work to do. I don't suppose anyone's spoken to the fishermen about restocking Sandil's house supplies? I don't know, Sergio, said the maid. I don't think so. Bainara marched down to the docks and relieved her troubled heart the only way she knew how, by concentrating on small things. Tay's words never left her, but she found temporary comfort talking to the fishermen about their haul, helping determine how much should be smoked, how much should be sent to the village, how much should be delivered fresh to the house larder. Her aunt Ulia joined the discussion, oblivious to Bainara's well-disguised agony. Together they discussed how many provisions Uncle Trifith and his commanders had devoured during their weeks on the island, when they would be expected to return, and how best to prepare. One of the fishermen on the docks called out, interrupting, "A boat is coming." Ulia and Bainara greeted the visitor as she arrived. It was a young woman dressed in the robes of temple priestess. As she docked her small boat, Bainara marveled at how beautiful she was and strangely familiar. "Welcome to Gorn," said Bainara. "I'm Indoril Bainara, and this is my aunt Indoril Ulia. Have we met before?" "I don't believe so, Sergio," the woman bowed. "I was sent by the temple to inquire whether word had come from your cousin Indoril Tay. He has been missing from his classes for some days now, and the priests have become concerned." "Oh, we should have sent word," Ulia fretted. "He came here a few days ago, half drowned. He's better now. Let us escort you up to the house." "Tay is resting now, and I ask that he not be disturbed," Bainara stammered. "Actually, I know it's dreadful manners, but I need to talk to my aunt for a moment. Would it be too terrible if I asked you to wait for us at the house? You have only to follow the path up the hill and cross the lawn." The priestess bowed again humbly and began the walk. Ulia was scandalized. "You know better than to treat a representative of the temple that way," she snapped. "You can't be so exhausted from tending your cousin to have lost all sense of civility." "Aunt Ulia," Bainara whispered, drawing the woman away from the ears of the fisherman. "Is Tay truly my cousin? He believes himself to be of the House Dagoth." Ulia took a moment to respond. "It's true. You were just a baby yourself during the war, so you couldn't know what it was like. There was not a part of Morrowind that wasn't ravaged. There was even a battle here on the island. Do you remember that burnt pile of wreckage you and Tay and poor little Vaster discovered so many years ago? That was their remains, and after the war, when that accursed house was finally defeated, we saw the little innocents, the orphans, whose only crime had been born to wicked parents. I admit there were some in our armies. The combined forces of the houses would have had them all slaughtered to annihilate the legacy of Dagoth. In the end, compassion prevailed, and the children of the sixth house were adopted into the others 5, and so we thought that we had won the war and the peace. By the mother, Lord and wizard, if all that Tay believes is true, then there is no peace. Bernard trembled. He claims that the song of his ancestors called to him and forced him to slay 3 people. 2 of them are housemen, cousin Calcorith and, when he was a little boy, Vaster. Ulia held her hands over her tearful face and could not speak. And it is only beginning, said Binara. The song still calls to him. He said there were others who knew who would help him raise up the 6th house, his sister. It must be an evil fantasy, Ulia murmured. She noticed that Binara's gaze was now upon the path leading from the docks towards the house. Niece, what are you thinking? Did that priestess give us her name? The 2 women ran up the path, calling for guards. The fishermen, who had never seen the mistresses of the house so undone, looked briefly at one another and then followed quickly behind, pulling out their hooks and blades. The front gate to Sandal House stood wide open, the first of the corpses lying close within. It was now an abattoir, painted fresh with blood. There was Anner, Uncle Triffitt's valet, gutted but still seated at the foyer table, where he had been enjoying his afternoon glass of Flynn. Lorraine, one of the chambermaids, had been decapitated while carrying some once clean linens up the stairs. The bodies of guards and servants sprawled about the hall like blown leaves. At the top of the stairs, Binara had to hold back a sob when she saw Helima. She lay like a broken doll, slain as she tried to pull herself out onto the narrow window ledge. No one spoke, not Binara, not Aunt Ulia, nor the fishermen, as they walked slowly through the blood-drenched house. They passed Tay's sick room, its door broken open, and no one within. When they heard the sound of footsteps in Binara's room down the hall, they approached slowly, cautiously, with great dread. The priestess from the docks was standing by the bed. In her hand was the silver ring Binara had taken from Tay's finger. In her other hand was a long, curved blade, splashed like her once pristine gown with gore. She smiled prettily and bowed when she saw she was no longer alone. Akra, I should have recognized you by Tay's description in his letters. Binara said in her steadiest voice, "Where is my cousin?" "I prefer to call myself Dagoth Akra," she replied. "Your false cousin, my true brother, has already gone to fulfill his destiny. I'm sorry you are not here so he could give you a more permanent farewell." Binara's face twisted in fury. She motioned for the fishermen, who advanced with their weaponry, tear her apart. "The 6th house will rise again, and Dagoth Tython will lead us." Akra laughed. Her words were still echoing as she gave the sign of recall and vanished like a ghost. The Poison Song, Book 6, by Bristin Zell. The magnificent sprawl of the stronghold of Indoranian was aglow in the light of the setting sun. Commander Jesred watched it slowly disappear into the horizon as he led the caravan southwestward. It was a strange practice for him to lead a night operation, but scarcely more bizarre than anything else he was facing. He was only 70 years of age, far from old for a Bosmer, and yet he felt like he belonged to another era. He had known the land of East Vardenfell his entire life. Every forest, every garden, every small village between Red Mountain and the Sea of Ghosts had been home to him, but now it was all different, twisted into a world he did not recognize since the eruption and the year of the sun's death. It made night travel all the more treacherous, but it was a risk he was ordered to take. The Ashmire appeared quite suddenly. If a sharp-sighted scout had seen it and given the signal, the entire caravan might have been swallowed whole. Jesred cursed it had not been on the map, but that was hardly surprising. It was a huge unnamed scathe stretching as far as anyone could see. The commander considered his options. He might lead his party to the southeast towards Tel Arun and then try an approach due west. As he consulted his map, he noticed a glimmer of a campfire in the distance. Accompanied by his lieutenants, Jesred drove his guar forward to investigate what appeared to be an Ashlander man and woman. "This is no longer your realm," he bellowed. "Don't you know it's been ruled by the temple that these are whole house lands now? The couple shuffled to their feet and began quietly walking away toward a narrow ridge between hill and Ashmire. Jethred called them back. "Do you know a way around this cave?" he asked. They nodded, their eyes still to the ground. Jethred signaled to his caravan. "You will lead us then." It was a treacherous winding crossing, almost too tight for the guars. The wagons themselves scraped as the drivers pulled to avoid the Ashmire. The Ashlander man and woman whispered to one another as they led the caravan. "What are you mumbling about, Nuwa?" Jethred hollered. The man did not turn around. "My sister and I were talking about the Dagoth rebellion, and she was guessing that you were bringing arms to the stronghold at Falansarano, which is why you chose to cross the Ashmire rather than taking the road." "I might have known," Jethred laughed. "You Ashlanders are so hopeful whenever you see signs of trouble in the houses and the temple. I had to dampen your spirits, but what you're speaking of is hardly a rebellion, merely a few isolated incidents of unpleasantness. Tell your sister that." As they plodded onward, the narrow ridge began to taper even more. The Ashlanders found a low, jagged crevice in the hills, a crack from a lava flow even predating Sun's death. The caravan scored the rock walls that it moved through. Commander Jethred, after 20 years of uncertainty in a land he did not understand, felt a twinge of his old instinct. This, he thought to himself, would be a fine place for an ambush. "Ashlander, how close are we?" he shouted. We have arrived," Dagoth Tython replied and gave the signal. The assault was over in mere minutes, and it had been calculated from the start. When the last body of the house guard had sunk beneath the Ashmire, only then was the inventory of the caravan revealed. It was better than they had hoped, virtually everything the rebellion needed: Daedric swords, dozens of suits of armor, quiver of fine ebony bolts, and rations enough to last for weeks. "Go on ahead to the camp." Tython smiled at his sister. "I lead the caravan. We should be there within a few hours' time." Akra kissed him passionately and gave the signal of recall. In an instant she was back in her tent, exactly as she had left it. Humming the song, she removed the Ashlander rags and chose an appropriately diaphanous gown from her trunks. Precisely the sort of dress Tython would love seeing her in when he returned. "Muaraza," she called to her servant, "summon the troops together. Tython and the others will be here very soon with all the weapons and rations we need. "Muaraza can't hear you now," said a voice Akra hadn't heard in weeks. He turned expertly, removed every trace of surprise from her face. It was indeed Indorel Bainara, but not the quivering creature she had left behind at the massacre at Sandil House. This woman was an armored warrior who spoke with mocking confidence. "She wouldn't be able to summon the troops if she could. You may have weapons and rations, Akra, but there is no one left to arm or feed." Dagoth Akra made the sign of recall, but nothing happened. "The moment we heard you banging around in the tent, my battle mages cast a diffusion of all magicka." Bainara smiled, opening the tent further to invite a dozen house soldiers in. "You won't be leaving. If you think that my brother will walk into your trap, you underestimated his allegiance to the song." Akra sneered. "It tells him everything he needs to know. I have convinced him to no longer fight it and let it lead him and us to our ultimate victory." "I've known him longer and better than you ever did," said Bainara coldly. "Now I want to hear what the song is saying to you. I want to know where I can find Tay." "Tython, my lady," Akra corrected her. "He's no longer a slave to your house and the temple lies. You can torture me all you wish, but I swear to you the next time you see him, it will be because he wishes it, not you, and that will be your very last moment alive." "Don't you worry, Sergio," Bainara's nightblade winked at her. "Everyone says they won't break under torture, but everyone always does." Bainara left the tent. It was all a part of warfare, she understood that. But there would be little relish in witnessing it. She could not even watch as the house soldiers disposed of the rebel corpses. She had hoped she would grow numb to the bloodshed after weeks of following Tython and Akra, massacre after massacre. It didn't matter to her that now the bodies were of her enemies. Death was still death. She had only been in her tent for a few minutes when her nightblade appeared. "Not so tough as she appeared, that one," he grinned. "In point of fact, all I had to do is asked her nice and point my dagger at her belly, and she was blubbering everything. Not too surprising really, it's always the ones that talk big that crumble fast. I remember way back, a couple years ago before you was even born, Garwan, what did she say? Vinara asked. The song, whatever that is, told her brother that she got herself caught and not to return to camp. The Nightblade replied, only a trifle annoyed at having his fascinating story cut short. He's got a half-dozen mer with him, and they're going to try to assassinate the fellow that led the Indoril army in the war, General Indoril Trifith. Uncle Trifith? Bainar gasped. Where is he stationed now? I'm not sure myself, Sergio. Do you want me to ask if she knows? I'll come with you, said Bainara. As they walked towards Akra's tent, cries of alarm sounded. The situation became abundantly clear even before they reached the site. 3 guards were dead and the prisoner had escaped. Interesting woman, said Garwan. Weak heart but a strong arm. Should we send a word of warning to General Indoril Trifith? If we can find where he is in time, said Bainara. Wait a sec. We need more water. Right, The Poison Song, Book 7 by Briston Zell. Trifith stood on the parapets of Brismane and considered the volcano. Metaphors the poets used fell rather flat in his view. A festering wound it could be called with its blood like lava. The kin of ash, too, could be applied when one looked at its perpetual crown of smoke, and yet none of that would do for nothing, and his experience could convey the sheer magnitude of the mountain. Red Mountain was many miles away from the fortress, and yet it filled the horizon utterly. Before he could feel too small, however, he heard his name being called within. It was some consolation that, though he was insignificant compared to the mountain, he was still in possession of certain power and influence. General Indoril Trifith, said Commander Rael. There's trouble at the east gate. The trouble was scarcely more than a skirmish. An Ashlander, drunk perhaps on Shane, had begun a fight with the house guards at the back gate. As they tried to drive him away, his cousins joined him, and soon there were 6 Ashlanders altogether brawling with a dozen of Trifith's guards. If the Enfois had not been well armed, the fight could have been finished almost before it began. As it was, by the time the general arrived with more of his guards, 2 of the Ashlanders were dead and the others had taken flight. It's the smoke in their brains, Rael shrugged, makes them mad. Trifith climbed back up the stairs and returned to his chamber to dress for dinner. General Redoran Vorilk and Councillor Hlalo Northok would be arriving very shortly to discuss the temple's plans for reorganizing the Houselands of Morrowind. Mournhall was to be renamed Almalexia. A grand new city in honor of Vivek was to be built, but with whose gold? It made his head hurt. There were so many details, a long night of arguments, threats, and compromises were ahead. The general's mind was so occupied that he nearly put his house robes on backwards. He also did not notice the shadowy figure steal out from behind the tapestry and close the door to the bedchamber. It was not until Trifith heard the sound of the ledge-bolt that he turned around. Slipped in when I was distracted by the fracas at the back gate. Very clever, Tay, he said simply. Or do you call yourself Dagoth Titan these days? You should know all my names, the young man snarled, unsheathing the sword. I was Tython before you butchered my family and sought to dispel my tribe. I was Tay when you brought me into your house to poison me against my own people. Now you may call me Vengeance. There was a knock on the door. Tython and Trifith did not move their eyes from one another. The knocking became a loud pounding. General Indoril Trifith, are you well? Is there something wrong? If you're going to kill me, boy, you'd best do it quickly, Trifith growled. My men will have that door down in 2 minutes. You don't tell me what to do, uncle. Tython shook his head. I have the song of my ancestors to instruct me. It tells me you made my father beg for his life before you killed him, and I want to see you do the same. If your ancestors are all knowing, Trifith smiled, why are they all dead? Tython made an inhuman noise in the back of his throat and advanced. The door began to buckle at the pounding, but it was sturdy and secure. The general estimate of its life expectancy at 2 minutes seemed clearly erroneous. The pounding suddenly stopped. A familiar voice replaced the sound. "Tay," called Bainara, "listen to me." Tython smirked. "You're just in time to hear your uncle beg for his miserable life, cousin. I was afraid you'd be too late. The next sound you'll hear will be the death rattle of the man who slaved my house. The song is what enslaved you, not Uncle Triffith. You can't trust it. It's poisoning you. It let you be manipulated first by that mad old woman, and now by that evil witch Akra who calls herself your sister." Tython pressed the tip of his sword so it touched the general's throat. The older man stepped backwards and Tython advanced. His eyes followed the length of his arm to the grip of the blade. The silver ring of Dagoth caught the red light of the volcano from the battlements outside the window. "Tay, please don't hurt anyone anymore. Please, if you just listen to me and not the song just a moment, you'll know what's right. I love you." Bainara stifled her sobs to keep her voice clear and calm. There was a noise from the stairwell behind her. The general's guard had finally arrived with a battering ram. The door splintered and burst open in 2 strikes. General Indoril Triffith was holding his throat, staring out the window. "Uncle, are you alright?" Bainara ran to him. He nodded his head slowly and removed his hand. There was only the barest of scratches on his neck. "Where's Tay?" "He jumped out the window," said Triffith, pointing out into the distance where a figure was riding a guar toward the volcano. "I thought he was going to kill himself, but he had an escape figured out." "We'll get him, Sergeant General," said Commander Rail, calling to the guards to get their mounts. Bainara watched them go, and they then kissed her uncle quickly and ran out to her own guar in the courtyard. Sweat drenched Tay's body as he rode closer and closer toward the summit of Red Mountain. The guar was breathing hard, trudging along even more slowly, letting out the little grunts of complaint about the heat. Finally he abandoned his steed and began to climb the near vertical surface. Ash blew down the face of the volcano to his eyes. Near blind, it was almost impossible to ignore the persistent clamorous notes of the song. A silken stream of crimson lava studded with crystalline formations surged a few feet away, close enough that Tay could feel his flesh begin to burn and blister. He turned from it and then saw a figure emerge through the smoke. "Bainara, what are you doing, Tay?" she cried over the hull of the volcano. "Didn't I tell you not to listen to the song?" "For the first time, the song and I both want the same thing," he yelled back. "I can't ask you to forgive me, but please try to forget." He pulled himself higher out of Bainara's sight. She screamed his name, scaling the rocks until she found she was close to the open crater. Waves of boiling gas washed over her and she dropped to her knees gasping. Through the rippling miasma, she saw Tay standing at the mouth of the volcano. Flames erupted from his clothes and hair. He turned to her just for a moment and smiled. Then he leapt. Bainara was in a daze as she began the long treacherous climb down the volcano. She began to think of the projects ahead. Were there enough provisions and storage at her house in Gorn for the meeting of the houses? The councillors were bound to stay there for weeks, maybe months. There was much work to be done. Slowly as she descended, she began to forget. It would not last, but it would be a start. Dagoth Akra stood as near to the mouth of the volcano as she could stand, blinking her eyes at the ash, soaked by the heat. She watched all and smiled. On the ground was the silver ring with the seal of the house Dagoth. Tython had been sweating so much it had slipped off. She picked it up and put it on her own finger. Touching her belly, she heard a new refrain of the poison song of Morrowind begin. Alright. It's just these books, A Dance in Fire, Volume 1, by Waigin Jarth. Scene, the Imperial City, Cyrodiil. Date, 7th Frostfall, 3rd year 397. It seemed as if the palace had always housed the Atreus Building Commission, the company of clerks and estate agents who authored and notarized nearly every construction of any note in the Empire. It had stood for 250 years since the reign of the Emperor Magnus, A plane fronted an austere hall on a minor but respectable plaza in the imperial city. Energetic and ambitious middle-class lads and ladies worked there, as well as complacent middle-aged ones like Decimus Scotti. No one could imagine a world without the Commission, least of all Scotti. To be accurate, he could not imagine a world without himself and the Commission. Lord Atreus is perfectly aware of your contributions, said the managing clerk, closing the shutter that demarcated Scotty's office behind him. But you know that things have been difficult. Yes, said Scotty stiffly. Lord Vanek's men have been giving us a lot of competition lately, and we must be more efficient if we are to survive. Unfortunately, that means releasing some of our historically best but presently underachieving senior clerks. I understand, can't be helped. I'm glad that you understand, smiled the managing clerk, smiling thinly and withdrawing. Please have your room cleared immediately. Scotty began the task of organizing all his work to pass on to his successor. It would probably be young Imbrelius who would take most of it on, which was as it should be, he considered philosophically. The lad knew how to find business. Scotty wondered idly what the fellows would do with the contracts for the new statue of St. Alessia for which the Temple of the One had applied. Probably invent a clerical error, blame it on his old predecessor Decimus Scotti, and require an additional cost to rectify. I have correspondence for Decimus Scotti of the Atreus Building Commission. Scotty looked up. A fat-faced courier had entered his office and was thrusting forth a sealed scroll. He handed the boy a gold piece and opened it up. By the poor penmanship, atrocious spelling and grammar, and overall unprofessional tone, it was manifestly evident who the writer was. Leodas Juris, a fellow clerk some years before, who had left the commission after being accused of unethical business practices. Dear Scotty, I imagine you always wondered what happened to me, and the last place you would have expected to find me is out in the woods, but that's exactly where I am. Haha, if you're smart and want to make a lot of extra gold for Lord Atreus and yourself, haha, you'll come down to Valenwood too. If you haven't been following the politics here lately, you may or may not know that there's been a war between the Bosmer and their neighbors elsewhere over the past 2 years. Things have only just calmed down, and there's a lot that needs to be rebuilt. I've got more business than I can handle, but I need someone with some clout, someone representing a respected agency to get the quill in the ink. That someone is you, my friend. Come meet me at the Therapascos Tavern in Falinesti, Valenwood. I'll be here 2 weeks and you won't be sorry. Juris, P.S. Bring a wagon load of timber if you can. What do you have there, Scotty? Asked the voice. Scotty started. It was Imbrelius, but his damnably handsome face peeking through the shutters, smiling in that way that melted the hearts of the stingiest of patrons and the roughest of stonemasons. Scotty shoved the letter in his jacket pocket. Personal correspondence, he sniffed. I'll be cleared up before in just a moment. I don't want to hurry you, said Imbrelius, grabbing a few sheets of blank contracts from Scotty's desk. I've just gone through a stack and the junior scribe's hands are all cramping up, so I thought you would miss a few. The lad vanished. Scotty retrieved the letter and read it again. He thought about his life, something he rarely did. It seemed a sea of grey with a black, insurmountable wall looming. There was only the narrow passage he could see in that wall. Quickly, before he had a moment to reconsider it, he grabbed a dozen of the blank contracts with the shimmering gold leaf Atreus Building Commission by appointment of His Imperial Majesty and hid them in the satchel with his personal effects. The next day he began his adventure with a giddy lack of hesitation. He arranged for a seat in a caravan bound for Valenwood, the single escorted conveyance to the southeast leaving the Imperial City that week. He had scarcely hours to pack, but he remembered to purchase a wagon load of timber. It will be extra gold to pay for a horse to pull that, frowned the convoy ahead. So I anticipated, smiled Scotty with his best Imbrelius grin. Wait a sec. 10 wagons and all set off that afternoon through the familiar Cyrodiilic countryside, past fields of windflowers, gently rolling woodlands, friendly hamlets. The clop of the horses' hooves against the soundstone road reminded Scotty that the Atreus Building Commission constructed it. 5 of the 18 necessary contracts for its completion were drafted by his own hand. Very smart of you to bring that wood along, said a grey-whiskered Breton man next to him on his wagon. You must be in commerce. Of a sort, said Scotty, in a way he hoped was mysterious, before introducing himself. Decimus Scotty. Griff Malone, said the man. I'm a poet, actually, and translator of Old Bosmer literature. I was researching some newly discovered tracts of the Monoriad play bar 2 years ago when the war broke out and I had to leave. You're no doubt familiar with the Monoriad, if you're aware of the Green Pact. Scotty thought the man might be speaking perfect gibberish, but he nodded his head. Naturally, I don't pretend that the Monoriad is renowned as the Aelidion, or as ancient as the Dancer Gaul, but I think it was remarkable significance to understanding the nature of the Mereolithic Bosmer mind, the origin of the wood elf aversion to cutting their own wood or eating any plant material at all, yet paradoxically their willingness to import plant stuff from other cultures, I feel, can be linked to a passage in the Monoriad. Malone shuffled through some of his papers, searching for the appropriate text. To Scotty's vast relief, the carriage soon stopped to camp for the night. They were high on a bluff over a great stream, and before them was the great valley of Valenwood. Only the cry of seabirds declared the presence of the ocean to the bay to the west. Here the timber was so tall and wide, twisting around itself like an impossible knot begun eons ago to be impenetrable. A few more modest trees, only 50 feet to the lowest branches, stood on the cliff at the edge of camp. The sight was so alien to Scotty, and he found himself so anxious about the proposition of entering the wilderness that he could not imagine sleeping. Fortunately, Malone had supposed he had found another academic with a passion for the riddles of ancient cultures. Long into the night he recited Bosmer verse in the original, and he was in his own translation, sobbing and bellowing and whispering wherever appropriate. Gradually Scotty began to feel drowsy, but a sudden crack of wood snapping made him sit straight up. What was that? Malone smiled. I like it too. Convocation in the malignity of the moonless speculum, a dance of fire. There are some enormous birds up in the trees moving around, whispered Scotty, pointing in the direction of the dark shapes above. I wouldn't worry about that, said Malone, irritated with his audience. Now listen to how the poet characterizes Hermomora's invocation in the 18th stanza of the 4th book. The dark shapes in the trees were some of them perched like birds, others slithered like snakes, and still others stood up straight like men. As Malone recited his verse, Scotty watched the figures softly leap from the branch to branch, how gliding across impossible distances for anything without wings. They gathered in groups and then reorganized until they had spread to every tree around the camp. Suddenly they plummeted from the heights. Mara, cried Scotty, they're falling like rain, probably seed pods. Malone shrugged, not turning around. Some of the trees have remarkable. The camp erupted into chaos. Fires burst out in the wagons. The horses wailed from mortal blows. Casks of wine, fresh water, and liquor gushed their contents to the ground. A nimble shadow dashed past Scotty and Malone, gathering sacks of grain and gold with impossible agility and grace. Scotty had only one glance at it, lit by a sudden nearby burst of flame. It was a sleek creature with pointed ears, white yellow eyes, mottled pied fur, and a tail like a whip. Werewolf, he whimpered, shrinking back. Cathay-rat, groaned Malone. Much worse, Khajiit cousins or some such thing come to plunder. Are you sure? As quickly as they struck, the creatures retreated, diving off the bluff before the battle mage and knight the caravan escorts had fully opened their eyes. Malone and Scotty ran to the precipice and saw 100 feet below the tiny figures dash out of the waters, shake themselves, and disappear into the wood. Werewolves aren't acrobats like that, said Malone. They were definitely Cathay-rat, bastard thieves, Thanks Tendar, they didn't realize the value of my notebooks. It wasn't a complete loss. Dancing Fire, Chapter 2, by Wei Jar. It was a complete loss. The Cathay-Rat had stolen or destroyed almost every item of value in the caravan in just a few minutes' time. Decimo Scotty's wagon load of wood he had hoped to trade with the Bosmer had been set on fire and then toppled off the bluff. His clothing and contracts were tattered and ground into the mud of dirt mixed with spilled wine. All the pilgrims, merchants and adventurers in the group mourned and wept as they gathered the remnants of their belongings by the rising sun of the dawn. I best not tell anyone that I managed to hold on to my notes for my translation of the Mnoriad play bar, whispered the poet Griff Malon. They'd probably turn on me. Scotty politely declined the opportunity of telling Malone just how little value he himself placed on the man's property. Instead, he counted the coins in his purse. 24 gold pieces, very little indeed for an entrepreneur beginning a new business. Oi! Came a cry from the wood. A small party of Bosmer emerged from the thicket, clad in leather mail and here bearing arms. Friend or foe? Neither, growled the convoy head. It must be the Cyrodiils, laughed the leader of the group, a tall skeleton, thin youth with a sharp vulpine face. We heard you were en route. Evidently so did our enemies. I thought the war was over, muttered one of the caravan's now ruined merchants. The Bosmer laughed again. No act of war, just a little border enterprise. You're going on to Falinesti? I'm not, the convoy head shook his head. As far as I'm concerned, my duty is done. No more horses, no more caravan. Just a fat profit lost to me. The men and women crowded around the man, protesting, threatening, begging, but he refused to step foot in Valenwood. If these were the new times of peace, he said, he'd rather come back for the next war. Scotty tried a different route and approached the Bosmer. He spoke with an authoritative but friendly voice, the kind he used in negotiations with peevish carpenters. I don't suppose you'd consider escorting me to Falinesti. I'm a representative for an important imperial agency, the Atreus Building Commission, here to help repair and alleviate some of the problems the war with Khajiit brought to your province. Patriotism, 20 gold pieces, and you must carry your own gear if you have any left, replied the Bosmer. Scotty reflected that negotiations with peevish carpenters rarely went his way either. 6 eager people had enough gold on them for payment. Among those without funds was the poet, who appealed to Scotty for assistance. I'm sorry, Griff, I only have 14 gold left over, not even enough for a decent room when I get to Falinesti. I really would help you if I could, said Scotty, persuading himself that it was true. The band of 6 and their Bosmer escorts began the descent down a rocky path along the bluff. Within an hour's time, they were deep in the jungles of Valenwood. A never-ending canopy of hues of browns and greens obscured the sky. A millennia's worth of fallen leaves formed a deep, wormy sea of putrefaction beneath their feet. Several miles were crossed wading through the slime. For several more, they took a labyrinthian path across fallen branches and the long-hanging boughs of giant trees. All the while, hour after hour, the inexhaustible Bosmer host moved so fast, the Cyrodiil struggled to keep from being left behind. A red-faced little merchant with short legs took a bad step on a rotten branch and nearly fell. His fellow provincials had to help him up. The Bosmer paused only a moment, their eyes continually drifting to the shadows in the trees above before moving on at their usual expeditious pace. What are they so nervous about? Wheezed the merchant irritably. More Cathay-Rat? Don't be ridiculous, laughed the Bosmer unconvincingly. Khajiit this far into Valenwood in times of peace, they'd never dare. When the group passed high enough above the swamp that the smell was somewhat dissipated, Scotty felt a sudden pang of hunger. He was used to 4 meals a day in the Cyrodiil custom. Hours of non-stop exertion without food was not part of his regimen as a comfortably paid clerk. He pondered, feeling somewhat delirious, how long they had been trotting through the jungle. 12 hours? 20? A week? Time was meaningless. Sunlight was only sporadic through the vegetative ceiling. Phosphorescent molds on the trees and in the mud below provided the only regular illumination. "It is only possible for us to rest and eat," he hollered to his host up ahead. "We're near to Falanesti," came the echoing reply. "Lots of food there." The path continued upward for several hours, more across a clod of fallen logs, rising up to the first and then the second boughs of the tree line. As they rounded a long corner, the travelers found themselves midway up a waterfall that fell 100 feet or more. No one had the energy to complain as they began pulling up the stacks of rock, agonizing foot by foot. The Bosmer escorts disappeared into the mist, but Scotty kept climbing until there was no more rock left. He wiped the sweat and river water from his eyes. Falanesti spread across the horizon before him. Sprawling across both banks of the river stood the mighty Gratok city, with groves and orchards of lesser trees crowding it like supplicants before their king. At a lesser scale, the tree that formed the moving city would have been extraordinary, gnarled and twisted, with a gorgeous crown of gold and green, dripping with vines and shining with sap. At a mile tall and half as wide, it was the most magnificent thing Scotty had ever seen. If he had not been a starving man with the soul of a clerk, he would have sung. "There you are," said the leader of the escorts. "Not too far a walk. You should be glad it's wintertide." In summertide, the city is on the far south end of this province. Scotty was lost as to how to proceed. The sight of the vertical metropolis, where people moved about like ants, disoriented all his sensibilities. "You wouldn't know of an inn called..." He paused for a moment and then pulled Jura's letter from his pocket. "Something like Mother Pasco's Tavern?" "Mother Pasco's?" The lead Bosmer laughed, his familiar contemptuous laugh. You won't want to stay there? Visitors always prefer the Aisia Hall in the top boughs. It's expensive but very nice. I met someone at Mother Pasco's Tavern. If you've made up your mind to go, take a lift to Havel's Slump and ask for directions there. Just don't get lost and fall asleep in the Western Cross." This apparently struck the youth's friends as a very witty jest, and so it was with their laughter echoing behind him that Scotty crossed the wreathing root system to the base of Falanesti. The ground was littered with leaves and refuse, and from moment to moment a glass or a bone would plummet from far above, so he walked with his neck crooked to have warning. An intricate network of platforms anchored to thick vines slipped up and down the slick trunk of the city with perfect grace, manned by operators with arms as thick as an ox's belly. Scotty approaches the nearest fellow at one of the platforms, who was idly smoking from a glass pipe. I was wondering if you might take me to Havel's Slump." The mer nodded, and within a few minutes' time Scotty was 200 feet in the air and at a crook between two mighty branches. Curled webs of moss stretched unevenly across the fork, forming a sharing roof for several dozen small buildings. There were only a few souls in the alley, but around the bend ahead you could hear the sound of music and people. Scotty tipped the Falanesti platform ferryman a gold piece and asked for the location of Mother Pasco's Tavern. "Straight ahead of you, sir, but you won't find anyone there," the ferryman explained, pointing in the direction of the noise. "More does everyone in Havel's Slump has revelry." Scotty walked carefully along the narrow street. Though the ground felt as solid as the marble avenues of the Imperial City, there were slick cracks in the bark that exposed fatal drops into the river. He took a moment to sit down, to rest and get used to the view from the heights. It was a beautiful day for certain, but it took Scotty only a few minutes of contemplation to rise up in alarm. A jolly little raft anchored downstream below him had distinctly moved several inches while he watched it, but it hadn't moved at all. He had, together with everything around him. It was no metaphor. The city of Falanesti walked, and considering its size, it moved quickly. Scotty rose to his feet into a cloud of smoke that drifted out from around the bend. It was the most delicious roast he had ever smelled. The clerk forgot his fear and ran. The revelry, as the ferryman had termed it, took place on an enormous platform tied to the tree, wide enough to be a plaza any other city, a fantastic assortment of the most amazing people Scotty had ever seen were jammed shoulder to shoulder together, many eating, many more drinking, and some dancing to a luthier and singer perched on an offshoot above the crowd. They were largely Bosmer, true natives clad in colorful leather and bones, with a close minority of orcs. Whirling through the throng, dancing and bellowing at one another, were hideous ape people. A few heads bobbing over the tops of the crowd belonged not, as Scotty first assumed, to very tall people, but to a family of centaurs. "Care for some mutton?" inquired a wizened old Mer who roasted enormous beasts on some red-hot rocks. Scotty quickly paid him a gold piece and devoured the leg he was given, and then another gold piece and another leg. The fellow chuckled when Scotty began choking on a piece of gristle, and handed him a mug of a frothing white drink. He drank it and felt a quiver run through his body, as if he were being tickled. "What is that?" Scotty asked. "Jaga, fermented pig's milk. I can let you have a flagon of it and a bit more mutton for another gold." Scotty agreed, paid, gobbled down the meat, and took the flagon with him as he slipped into the crowd. His co-worker, Leonis Jurus, the man who had told him to come to Valenwood, was nowhere to be seen. When the flagon was a quarter empty, Scotty stopped looking for Joris. When it was half empty, he was dancing with a group oblivious to the broken planks and gaps in the fence work. At 3/4 empty, he was trading jokes with a group of creatures whose language was completely alien to him. By the time the flagon was completely drained, he was asleep, snoring, while the revelry continued all around his supine body. The next morning, still asleep, Scotty had the sensation of someone kissing him. He made a face to return the favor, but a pain like fire spread through his chest and forced him to open his eyes. There was an insect the size of a large calf sitting on him, crushing him, its spiky legs holding him down, while a central spiral-bladed vortex of a mouth tore through his shirt. He screamed and thrashed, but the beast was too strong. It had found its meal and it was going to finish it. "It's over," thought Scotty wildly. "I should have never left home. I could have stayed in the city and perhaps found work with Lord Vanek. I could have begun again as a junior clerk and worked my way back up." Suddenly the mouth released itself. The creature shivered once, expelled a burst of yellow bile, and died. "Got one," cried a voice not too distantly. For a moment Scotty lay still. His head throbbed and his chest burned. Out of the corner of his eyes he saw movement. Another of the horrible monsters was scurrying towards him. He scrambled, trying to push himself free, but before he could come out, there was a sound of a bow cracking and an arrow pierced the second insect. "Good shot," cried another voice, "but get the first one again. I just saw it move a little." This time Scotty felt the impact. The bolt hit the carcass. He cried out, but he could hear how muffled his voice was by the beetle's body. Cautiously he tried sliding a foot out and rolling under, but the movement apparently had the effect of convincing the archers that the creature still lived. A volley of arrows was launched forth. Now the beast was sufficiently perforated so pools of its blood, and likely the blood of its victims, began to seep out onto Scotty's body. When Scotty was a lad, before he grew too sophisticated for such sports, he had often gone to the Imperial Arena for the competitions of war. He recalled a great veteran of the fights when asked, telling him his secret: "Whenever I'm in doubt of what to do and I have a shield, I stay behind it." Scotty followed that advice. After an hour, when he no longer heard arrows being fired, he threw aside the remains of the buck and leapt as quickly as he could to a stand. It was not a moment too soon. A gang of 8 archers had their bows pointing in his direction, ready to fire. When they saw him, they laughed. "Did anyone ever tell you not to sleep in the Western Cross? How are we going to exterminate all the Horvors if you drunks keep feeding them?" Scotty shook his head and walked back along the platform, round and bent to Havel Slump. He was bloated and torn and tired, and he had far too much fermented pig's milk. All he wanted was a proper place to lie down. He stepped into Mother Pascal's tavern, a dank place wet with sap, smelling of mildew. "My name is Decimus Scotty," he said. "I was hoping you have someone named Jura staying here." "Decimus Scotty?" pondered the fleshy proprietress. Mother Pascos herself. I've heard that name. Oh, you must be the fellow he left the note for. Let me go see if I can find it. Well, 5 more books of it. I need a small pause and we shall return to our stream. Be right back. Alright, I'm back. So we've got A Dance in Fire, Volume 3. Chapter 3 by Wayne Jarth. Mother Pascos disappeared into the sordid hall that was her tavern and emerged a moment later with a scrap of paper with Lyra's Jura's familiar scrawl. Taking Scotty held it up before a patch of sunlight that had found its way through the massive boughs of the tree city and read, "Scotty, you made it to Falinesti, well and good. Congratulations. I'm sure you had quite an adventure getting here. Unfortunately, I'm not here anymore, as you probably guess. There's a town downriver called Athia I'm at. Get a boat and join me. It's ideal. I hope you brought a lot of contracts, cause these people need a lot of building done. They were close to the war, you see, but not so close they don't have any more left to pay. Haha, meet me down here as soon as you can. Juras." So Scotty pondered. Juras had left Falinesti and gone to some place called Athia. Given his poor penmanship and ghastly spelling, it could equally be Athi, Afi, O3, Imthri, Urtha, or Krakamaka. The sensible thing to do, Scotty knew, was to call this adventure over and try to find some way to get back home to the Imperial City. He was no mercenary devoted to a life of thrills. He was, or at least had been, a senior clerk at a successful private building commission. Over the last few weeks, he had been robbed by the Cathay Rod, taken on a death march through the jungle by a gang of giggling Bosmeri, half-starved to death, drugged with fermented pig's milk, nearly slain by some kind of giant tick, and attacked by archers. He was filthy, exhausted, and had he counted 10 gold pieces to his name. Now the man whose proposal brought him to the depths of misery was not even here. It was both judicious and seemly to abandon the enterprise entirely. And yet a small but a distinct voice in his head told him, "You have been chosen. You have no other choice but to see this through." Scotty turned to the stout old woman, Mother Pascost, who had been watching him curiously. "I was wondering if you knew of a village that was at the edge of the recent conflict with elsewhere. It's called something like Athea. You must mean Athay." She grinned. "My middle lad, Viglil, he manages a dairy down there." "Dairy. Beautiful country right on the river. Is that where your friend went?" "Yes," said Scotty. "Do you know the fastest way to get there?" After a short conversation, an even shorter ride to Father Nestie's roots by way of the platforms and a jog to the river bank, Scotty was negotiating transport with a huge fair-haired Bosmer with a face like pickled carp. He called himself Captain Balfix, but even Scotty with his sheltered life could recognize him for what he was: a retired pirate for hire, a smuggler for certain, and probably much worse. His ship, which had clearly been stolen in the distant past, was a bent old imperial sloop. 50 golden will be in Athay in 2 days' time," boomed Captain Balfix expansively. "I have 10, no, sorry, 9 gold pieces," replied Scotty, and feeling the need for explanation added, "I had 10, but I gave 1 to the platform fireman to get me down here." "9 is just as fine," said the captain agreeably. "Truth be told, I was going to Athay whether you paid me or not. Make yourself comfortable on the boat, we'll be leaving in just a few minutes." Decimo Scotty boarded the vessel, which sat low in the water of the river, stacked high with crates and sacks that spilled out of the hold and galley and onto the deck. Each was marked with stamps advertising the most innocuous substances: copper scraps, lard, ink, high rock meal, marked for cattle, tar, fish jelly. Scotty's imagination really picturing what sorts of illicit imports were truly aboard. It took more than those few minutes for Captain Balfix to haul in the rest of his cargo, but in an hour the anchor was up and they were sailing downriver towards Athay. The green-grey water barely rippled, only touched by the fingers of the breeze. Lush plant life crowded the banks, obscuring from sight all the animals that sang or roared at one another. Lulled by the serene surroundings, Scotty drifted to sleep. At night he awoke and gratefully accepted some clean clothes and food from Captain Balfix. Why are you going to Athay, if I may ask?" queried the Bosmer. "I'm meeting a former colleague there. He asked me to come down from the Imperial City where I worked for the Atreus Building Commission to negotiate some contracts." Scotty took another bite of the dried sausages they were sharing for dinner. "We're going to try to repair and refurbish whatever bridges, roads, and other structures that got damaged in the recent war with the Khajiit. It's been a hard 2 years," the captain nodded his head. "Though I suppose good for me and the likes of you and your friend. Trade routes cut off. Now they think there's going to be war with the Somerset Isles. You heard that?" Scotty shook his head. "I've done my share of smuggling skooma down the coast. Even happy some revolutionary types escaped the Maine's wrath, but now the wars have made me a legitimate trader, a businessman. The first casualties of war is always the corrupted." Scotty said he was sorry to hear that, and they lapsed into silence, watching the stars and moon's reflection on the still water. The next day, Scotty awoke to find the captain wrapped up in his sail, torpid with alcohol, singing in a low, slurred voice. When he saw Scotty rise, he offered his flagon of Jaga. "I learned my lesson during revelry at Western Cross." The captain laughed and then burst into tears. "I don't want to be legitimate. Other pirates I used to know are still raping and stealing and smuggling and selling nice folk like you into slavery. I swear to you, I never thought the first time that I ran a real shipment of legal goods that my life would turn out like this. Oh, I know I could go back to it, but Bandar knows not after all I've seen. I'm a ruined man." Scotty helped the whipping mare out of the sail, murmuring words of reassurance. Then he added, "Forgive me for changing the subject, but where are we?" "Oh," moaned the Captain Balfix miserably, "we made good time. Ethe is right round the bend in the river." "Then it looks like Ethe is on fire," said Scotty, pointing. A great plume of smoke, black as pitch, was rising above the trees. As they drifted around the bend, they next saw the flames and then the blackened skeletal remains of the village. Dying, blazing villagers leapt from the rocks into the river. A cacophony of wailing met their ears, and they could see roaming along the edges of the town the figures of Khajiit soldiers bearing torches. "Bandar bless me," slurred the captain, "the war's back on." "Oh no," whimpered Scotty. The sloop drifted with the current towards the opposite shore, away from the fire town. Scotty turned his attention there, and the sanctuary it offered. Just a peaceful arbor, away from the horror. There was shudder of leaves in two of the trees, and a dozen lithe Khajiit dropped to the ground, armed with bows. "They see us," hissed Scotty, "and they've got bows." "Well, of course they have bows," snarled Captain Balfix. "We Bosmer may have invented the bloody things, but we didn't think to keep them secret, you bloody bureaucrat. Now they're setting their arrows on fire." "Yes, they do that sometimes." "Captain, they're shooting at us. They're shooting at us with flaming arrows." "Ah, so they are," the captain agreed. "The aim here is to avoid being hit." But hit they were, and very shortly thereafter. Even worse, the second volley of arrows hit the supply of pitch, which ignited in tremendous blue blaze. Scotty grabbed Captain Balfix and they leapt overboard just before the ship and all its cargo disintegrated. The shock of the cold water brought the Bosmer into temporary sobriety. He called to Scotty, who was already swimming as fast as he could towards the bend. "Master Decimus, where do you think you're swimming to?" "Back to Falinesti," cried Scotty. "It will take you days, and by the time you get there, everyone will know about the attack on Ethe. They'll never let anyone they don't know in. The closest village downriver is Granos. Maybe they'll give us shelter." Scotty swam back to the captain, and side by side they began paddling in the middle of the river, past the burning residuum of the village. He thanked Mara that he had learned to swim. Many a Cyril did not, as largely landlocked as the Imperial province was. Had he raised in Murkorop or Artemon, he might have been doomed, but the Imperial city itself was encircled by water, and every lad and lass there knew how to cross without a boat, even those who grew up to be clerks and not adventurers. Captain Balfix's sobriety faded as he grew used to the water's temperature. Even in wintertide, the Zillow River was fairly temperate and after a fashion even comfortable. The Bosmer's strokes were uneven, and he'd stray closer to Scotty and then further away, pushing ahead and then falling behind. Scotty looked to the shore to his right. The flames had caught the trees like tinder. Behind them was an inferno with which they were barely keeping pace. The shore on their left all looked fair until he saw a tremble in the river reeds, and then what caused it? A pride of the largest cats he had ever seen. They were auburn-haired, green-eyed beasts with jaws and teeth to match his wildest nightmares, and they were watching the two swimmers and keeping pace. "Captain Balfix, we can't go to either that shore or the other one, or we'll parboiled or eaten." "Or be parboiled or eaten," Scotty whispered. "Try to even your kicking and your strokes. Breathe like you would normally. If you're feeling tired, tell me, and we'll float on our backs for a while." Anyone who has had the experience of giving rational advice to a drunkard would understand the hopelessness. Scotty kept pace with the captain, slowing himself, quickening, drifting left and right, while the Bosmer moaned old ditties from his pirate days. When he wasn't watching his companion, he watched the cats at the shore. After a stretch, he turned to his right. Another village had caught fire. Undoubtedly it was Granos. Scotty stared at the blazing fury, awed by the sight of the destruction, and did not hear that the captain had ceased to sing. When he turned back, Captain Balfix was gone. Scotty dove into the murky depths of the river over and over again. There was nothing to be done. When he surfaced after his final search, he saw that the giant cats had moved on, perhaps assuming that he too had drowned. He continued his lonely swim downriver. A tributary, he noted, had formed a final barrier, keeping the flames from spreading further. But there were no more towns. After several hours, he began to ponder the wisdom of going ashore. Which shore was the question? He was spared the decision. Ahead of him was a rocky island with a bonfire. He did not know if he were intruding on a party of both Mary and Khajiit, only that he could swim no more. With straining, aching muscles, he pulled himself onto the rocks. They were Bosmer refugees, he gathered, even before they told him. Roasting over the fire was the remains of one of the giant cats that had been stalking him through the jungle on the opposite shore. Senshi tiger, said one of the young warriors ravenously. It's no animal, it's as smart as any Kathirat or Omes or any other bleeding Khajiit. Pity this one drowned. I would have gladly killed it. You like the meat though, sweet from all the sugar these asses eat. Scotty did not know if he was capable of eating a creature as intelligent as a man or mer, but he surprised himself as he had done several times over the last days. It was rich, succulent and sweet, like sugared pork, but no seasonings had been added. He surveyed the crowd as he ate. A sad lot, some still weeping for lost family members. They were the survivors of both the villages of Grenos and Athe, and war was on every person's lips. Why had the Khajiit attacked again? Why specifically directed at Scotty as a Cyrodiil? Why was the Emperor not enforcing peace in his provinces? I was to meet another Cyrodiil, he said to a Bosman maiden who he understood to be from Athe. His name was Leodas Juris. I don't suppose you know what might have happened to him. I don't know your friend, but there were many Cyrodiils in Athe when the fire came, said the girl. Some of them I think left quickly. They were going to Vindisi, inland in the jungle. I'm going there tomorrow, so are many of us. If you wish, you may come as well. Decimos Scotty nodded solemnly. He made himself as comfortable as he could in the stony ground of the river island, and somehow, after much effort, he fell asleep, but he did not sleep well. 4 more books, and there are these 3, and we're done. A Dance in Fire, Chapter 4 by Wayohin Jarth. 18 Bosmeri and 1 Cyrodiilic former senior clerk for the Imperial Building Commission trudged through the jungle westward from the Zilla River to the ancient village of Vindisi. For Decimos Scotty, the jungle was hostile, unfamiliar ground. The enormous vermiculated trees filled the bright morning with darkness, and resembled nothing so much as grasping claws, bent on impeding their progress. In the front of the low plants quivered with malevolent energy. What was worse, he was not alone in his anxiety. His fellow travelers, the natives who had survived the Khajiit attacks on the villages of Grenos and Athe, wore faces of undisguised fear. There was something sentient in the jungle, and not merely the mad but benevolent indigenous spirits. In his peripheral vision, Scotty could see the shadows of the Khajiit following the refugees, leaping from tree to tree. When he turned to face them, the little forms vanished into the gloom as if they had never been there. But he knew he had seen them, and the Bosmeri saw them too, and quickened their pace. After 18 hours, beaten raw by insects, scratched by 1,000 thorns, they emerged into a valley clearing. It was night, but a row of blazing torches greeted them, illuminating the leather-wrought tents and jumbled stones of the hamlet of Vindisi. At the end of the valley, the torches marked a sacred site, a gnarled bower of trees pressed close together to form a temple. Wordlessly, the Bosmer walked the torch arcade towards the trees. Scotty followed them. When they reached the solid mass of living wood with only one gaping portal, Scotty could see a dim blue light glowing within. A low sonorous moan from 100 voices echoed within. The Bosmer maiden he had been following held out her hand, stopping him. You do not understand, but no outsider, not even a friend, may enter, she said. This is a holy place. Scotty nodded and watched the refugees march into the temple, heads bowed. Their voices joined with the ones within. When the last wood elf had gone inside, Scotty turned his attention back to the village. There must be food to be had somewhere. A tendril of smoke and a faint whiff of roasting venison beyond the torchlight led him. There were 5 Cyrodiils, 2 Bretons and a Nord. the group gathered around a campfire of glowing white stones, pulling streaming strips of meat from the cadaver of a great stag. As Scotty's approached, they rose up, all but the Nord, who was distracted by his hunk of animal flesh. "Good evening. Sorry to interrupt, but I was wondering if I might have a little something to eat. I'm afraid I'm rather hungry after walking all day with some refugees from Granison Athe." They begged him to sit down and eat and introduce themselves. "So the war's back on, it seems," said Scotty amiably. Best thing for these have to do nothing," replied the Nord in between bites. "I've never seen such a lazy culture. Now they've got the Khajiit striking them on land and the High Elves at sea. If there's any province that deserves a little distress, it's damn little Valenwood." "I don't see how they're so offensive to you," laughed one of the Bretons. "Congenital thieves, even worse than the Khajiit because they are so blessed meek in their aggressions." The Nord spat out a gob of fat which sizzled on the hot stones of the fire. "They spread their forest into territory that doesn't belong to them, slowly infiltrating their neighbors, and they're puzzled when elsewhere shows back at them. They're all villains of the worst order." "What are you doing here?" asked Scotty. "I'm a diplomat from the court of Gehenna," muttered the Nord, returning to his food. "What about you? What are you doing here?" asked one of the Cyrodiils. "I work for Lord Atreus' building commission in the Imperial City," said Scotty. "One of my former colleagues suggested that I come down to Valenwood. He said the war was over and I could contract a great deal of business for my firm rebuilding what was lost. One disaster after disaster, and I've lost all my money. I'm in the middle of a rekindling of war, and I cannot find my former colleague." "Your former colleague?" murmured another of the Cyrodiils, who had introduced himself as Regulius. "He wasn't by any chance named Leodes Juris, was he? You know him?" "He lured me down the Valenwood in nearly the exact same circumstances," smiled Regulius grimly. "I worked for your employer's competitor, Lord Vanek's man, where Leodes Juris also formerly worked. He wrote to me asking that I represent an Imperial Building Commission and contract some post-war construction. I had just been released from my employment, and I thought that if I brought some new business I could have my job back. Juris and I met in Athe, and he said he was going to arrange a very lucrative meeting with the Sylvanar." Scotty was stunned. "Where is he now?" "I'm no theologian, so I couldn't say," Regulus shrugged. "He's dead. When the Khajiit attacked Athe, they began by torching the harbor where Juris was raiding his boat, or I should say my boat, since it was purchased with the gold I brought. By the time we were even aware of what was happening enough to flee, everything by the water was ash. The Khajiit may be animals, but they know how to arrange an attack." "I think they followed us through the jungle to Vindisi," said Scotty nervously. "There was definitely a group of something jumping along the treetops. Probably one of the monkey folk," snorted the Nord. "Nothing to be concerned about." When we first came to Vindisi and the Bosmere all entered that tree, they were furious, whispering something about unleashing an ancient terror on their enemies. The Breton shivered, remembering. "They've been there ever since, for over a day and a half now. If you want something to be afraid of, that's the direction to look." The other Breton, who was a representative of the Daggerfall Mages Guild, was staring off into the darkness while his fellow provincial spoke. "Maybe, but there's something in the jungle too, right on the edge of the village looking in." "More refugees, maybe?" asked Scott, trying to keep the alarm out of his voice. "Not unless they're traveling through the trees now," whispered the wizard. The Nord and one of the Cyrodiils grabbed a long tarp of wet leather and pulled it across the fire, instantly extinguishing it without so much as a sizzle. Now Scotty could see the intruders, their elliptical yellow eyes and long cruel blades catching the torchlight. He froze with fear, praying that he too was not so visible to them. He felt something bump against his back and gasped. Regulus' voice hissed from up above, "Be quiet for Mara's sake and climb up here." Scotty grabbed hold of the nose of double vine that hung down from a tall tree at the edge of the dead campfire. He scrambled up it as quickly as he could, holding his breath lest any grunt of exertion escape him. At the top of the vine, high above the village, was an abandoned nest from some great bird in a trident-shaped branch. As soon as Scotty had pulled himself into the soft, fragrant straw, Regulus pulled up the vine. No one else was there, and when Scotty looked down, he could see no one below. No one, that is, except the Khajiit slowly moving toward the glow of the temple tree. "Thank you," whispered Scotty, deeply touched that a competitor had helped him. He turned away from the village and saw that the tree's upper branches brushed against the mossy rock walls that surrounded the valley below. "How are you at climbing?" "You're mad," said Regulus under his breath. "We should stay here until they leave." If they burned Vindisi like they did Arthea and Granos, we'll be dead sure as we were on the ground. Scotty began the slow, careful climb up the tree, testing each branch. "Can you see what they're doing?" "I can't really tell." Regulus stared down into the gloom. "They're at the front of the temple. I think they also have, it looks like, long ropes trailing off behind them, off into the pass." Scotty crawled into the strongest branch that pointed toward the wet, rocky face of the cliff. It was not a far jump at all, so close in fact that he could smell the moisture and feel the coolness of the stone, but it was jump nevertheless, and in his history as a clerk, he had never before leapt from a tree 100 feet off the ground to a sheer rock. He pictured in his mind's eye the shadows that had pursued him through the jungle from their heights above, how their legs coiled to spring, how their arms snapped forward in an elegant, fluid motion to grasp. He leapt. Wait a sec. His hands grappled the rock, but long thick cores of moss were more accessible. He held hard, but when he tried to plant his feet forward, they slipped up skyward. For a few seconds he found himself upside down before he managed to pull himself into a more conventional position. It was a narrow outcropping jutting out of the cliff where he could stand and finally exhale. "Regulus! Regulus! Regulus!" Scotty did not dare to call out. In a minute there was a shaking of branches, and Lord Venex's man emerged. First his satchel, then his head, then the rest of him. Scotty started to whisper something, but Regulus shook his head violently and pointed downward. One of the Khajiit was at the base of the tree, peering at the remains of the campfire. Regulus awkwardly tried to balance himself on a branch, but as strong as it was exceedingly difficult with only one free hand. Scotty cupped his palms and then pointed at the satchel. It seemed to pain Regulus to let it out of his grasp, but he relented and tossed it to Scotty. There was a small, almost invisible hole in the bag, and when Scotty caught it, a single gold coin dropped out. It rang as it bounced against the rock wall on the descent, a high soft sound that seemed like the loudest alarm Scotty had ever heard. Then many things happened very quickly. The Cathayrite at the base of the tree looked up and gave a loud wail. The other Khajiit followed in chorus, and as the cat below crashed down and then sprung up into the lower branches. Regulus saw it below him, climbing up with impossible dexterity and panicked. Even before he jumped, Scotty could tell that he was going to fall. With a cry, Regulus the clerk plunged to the ground, breaking his neck on impact. A flash of white fire erupted from every crevice on the temple, and the moan of the Bosmer prayer changed to something terrible and otherworldly. The climbing Cathayrite stopped and stared. "Cairgo," it gasped, "the wild hunt." It was as if a crack in reality had opened wide. A flood of horrific beasts, tentacled toads, insects of armor and spine, gelatinous serpents, vaporous beings with the face of gods, all poured forth from the grey hollow tree, blind with fury. They tore the Khajiit in front of the temple to pieces. All the other cats fled for the jungle, but as they did so, they began pulling on the ropes they carried. In a few seconds' time, the entire village of Vindisi was boiling with the lunatic apparitions of the wild hunt. Of the babbling, barking, howling scorn, Scotty heard the Cyrodiils in hiding cry out as they were devoured. The North too was found and eaten, and both Bretons. The wizard had turned himself invisible, but the swarm did not rely on their sight. The tree the Cathayrite was in began to sway and rock from the impossible violence beneath it. Scotty looked at the Khajiit's fear-struck eyes and held out one of the cores of moss. The cat's face showed its pitiful gratitude as it leapt for the vine. He didn't have time to entirely replace that expression when Scotty pulled back the cord and watched it fall. The hand consumed it to the bone before it struck the ground. Scotty's own jump up to the next outcropping of rock was immeasurably more successful. From there he pulled himself to the top of the cliff and was able to look down to the chaos that has been the village of Edisi. The Han's mask had grown and began to spill out throughout the pass of the valley, pursuing the fleeing Khajiit. It was then that the madness truly began. In the moon's light from Scotty's vantage, he could see where the Khajiit had attached their ropes. With a thunderous boom, an avalanche of boulders poured over the pass. When the dust cleared, he saw that the valley had been sealed. The wild hunt had nowhere to turn but to it on itself. Scotty turned his head, unable to bear to look at the cannibalistic orgy. The night jungle stood before him, a web of wood. He slung Regulus' satchel over his shoulder and entered. Dance and Fire, Chapter 5, by Wayahin Jarth. Soap, the forest will eat love, straight ahead, stupid and stupid cow. The voice boomed out so suddenly that Decimus Scotty jumped. He stared off into the dim jungle glades from which he only heard animal and insect calls and the low whistling of wind moments before. It was a queer, oddly accented voice of indiscriminate gender, tremulous in its modulations but unmistakably human, or at the very least elven. An isolated bossman, perhaps with a poor grasp of the Cyrodiilic language. After countless hours of plodding through the dense knot of valley wood jungle, any voice of slight familiarity sounded wondrous. "Hello?" he cried. Beetle said, "On any names?" "Certainly yesterday, yes." The voice called back, "Who, what, and when, and mice?" "I'm afraid I don't understand," replied Scotty, turning towards the bramble tree, thick as a wagon, where the voice had issued. "But you needn't be afraid of me. My name is Decimus Scotty. I'm a Cyrodiil from the Imperial City. I came here to help rebuild Valenwood after the war, you see, and I'm rather lost." "Gemstones and grilled slaves, the war," moaned the voice and broke down into sobs. "You know about the war? I wasn't even sure how far away from the border I am now." Scotty began slowly walking toward the tree. He dropped Regulus' satchel to the ground and held out his empty hands. "I'm unarmed. I only want to know the way to the closest town. I'm trying to meet my friend, Leodus Juris, in Sylvanar." "Sylvanar," the voice laughed. It laughed even louder as Scotty circled the tree. Worms and wine, Sylvanar sings for worms and wine." There was nothing to be found anywhere around the tree. "I don't see you. Why are you hiding?" In frustration born of hunger and exhaustion, he struck the tree trunk. A sudden shiver of gold and red erupted from a hollow nook above, and Scotty was surrounded by 6-winged creatures scarcely more than a few inches long. Bright crimson eyes were set on either side of tunnel-like protuberances, the animals' always open mouths. They were legless, and their thin, rapidly beating, aureate wings seemed poorly constructed to transport their fat, swollen bellies, and yet they darted through the air like sparks from a fire. Whirling about the poor clerk, they began chattering what he now understood to be perfect nonsense. "Wines and worms, how far from the border am I? Academic garnishments and alas, Leodus Juris. Hello, I'm afraid I'm unarmed. Smoke and flames, and the closest town is dear Oblivion, swollen on a bad mead, and Idigo Nimbus, but you needn't be afraid of me." Why are you hiding? Before I begin to friend, love me, Lady Zuleika." Furious with the mimics, Scotty swung his arms, driving them up into the treetops. He stormed back to the clearing and opened up the satchel again, as he had done some hours before. There was still, unsurprisingly, nothing useful in the bag, and nothing to eat in any corner or pocket. A goodly amount of gold. He smiled grimly as he had done before at the irony of being financially solvent in the jungle. A stack of neat blank contracts from Lord Vannick's building commission, some thin cord, and an oiled leather cloak for bad weather. At least Scotty considered he had not suffered rain. A rolling moan of thunder reminded Scotty of what he had suspected for some weeks now. He was cursed. Within an hour's time, he was wearing the cloak and clawing his way through the mud. The trees, which had earlier allowed no sunlight and provided Ian provided no shelter against the pounding storm and wind. The only sounds that pierced the pelting of the rain were the mocking calls of the flying creatures flitting just above, babbling their nonsense. Scotty bellowed at them through rocks, but they seemed enamored of his company. While he was reaching to grab a promising looking stone to hurl at his tormentors, Scotty felt something shift beneath his feet. Wet but solid ground suddenly liquefied and became a rolling tide, rushing him forward. Light as a leaf, he flew head over feet over head until the mud flow dropped and he continued forward, plunging down to the river 25 feet below. The storm passed quite as instantly as it had arrived. The sun melted the dark clouds and warmed Scotty as he swam for the shore. There another sign of the Khajiit incursion into Valenwood greeted him. A small fishing village had stood there once, so recently extinct that it smoldered like a still warm corpse. Dirt caves that had once housed fish, but the smell of them had been ravaged, their bounty turned to ash. Rafts and skiffs lay broken, scuttled, half submerged. All the villagers were no more, either dead or refugees far away, or so he presumed. Something banged against the wall of one of the ruins. Scotty ran to investigate. "My name is Decimus Scotty," sang the first winged beast. "I'm Mercurial from the Imperial City. I came here to help rebuild Valenwood after the war, you see, and now I'm rather lost." I swelled to immaculate a panic. Agreed one of his companions. "I don't see you. Why are you hiding?" As they fell into chattering, Scotty began to search the rest of the village. Surely the cats had left something behind, a scrap of dried meat, a morsel of fish sausage, anything, but they had been immaculate in their complete annihilation. There was nothing to eat anywhere. Scotty did find one item of possible use under the tumbled remains of a stone hut, a bow and 2 arrows made of bone. A string had been lost, likely burned away in the heat of the fire, but he pulled the cord from Regulus' satchel and restrung it. The creatures flew over and hovered nearby as he worked. The convent of the sacred Leodas Juris. You know about the war. Worms and vines circumscribe a golden host, Apeneck. The moment the cord was taut, Scotty knocked an arrow and swung around it, pulling the string tight against his chest. The winged beasts, having had experience with the archers before, shot off in all directions in a blur. They needn't have bothered. Scotty's first arrow dove into the ground 3 feet in front of him. He swore and retrieved it. The mimics, having likewise had experience with poor archers before, returned at once to hovering nearby and mocking Scotty. On his second shot, Scotty did much better in purely technical terms. He remembered how the archers in Falanesti looked when he pulled himself out from under the Horvor tick, and they were all taking aim at him. He extended his left hand, right hand and right elbow in a symmetrical line, drawing the bow so his hand touched his jawline, and he could see the creature in his sight like the arrow was a finger he was pointing with. The bolt missed the target by only 2 feet, but it continued on its trajectory, snapping when it struck a rock wall. Scotty walked to the river's edge. He had only 1 arrow left, and perhaps he considered it would be most practical to find a slow-moving fish and fire it on that. If he missed, at least there was less of a chance of breaking the shaft, and he could always retrieve it from the water. A rather torpid, whiskered fish rolled by, and he took aim at it. "My name is Decimus Scotty," one of the creatures howled, frightening the fish away. "Stupid and stupid cow, will you dance and dance in fire?" Scotty turned and aimed the arrow as he had done before. This time, however, remembered to plant his feet as the archers had done, 7 inches apart, knees straight, left leg slightly forward to meet the angle of his right shoulder. He released the last arrow. The arrow also proved a serviceable prong for roasting the creature against the smoking hot stones of one of the ruins. Its other companions had disappeared instantly after the beast was slain, and Scotty was able to die in peace. The meat proved to be delicious, if scarcely more than the first course. He was picking the last of it from the bones when a boat sailed into view from around the bend of the river. At the helm were Bosmer sailors. Scotty ran to the bank and waved his arms. They averted their eyes and continued past. "You bloody callous bastards," Scotty howled. "Knaves, hooligans, ape-necked scoundrels." A grey-whiskered form came out from a hedge, and Scotty immediately recognized him as Griff Malone, the poet translator he had met in the caravan from Cyrodiil. He peered Scotty's direction, and his eyes lit up with delight. Decimos Scotty, precisely the man I hoped to see. I want to get your thoughts on a rather puzzling passage of the Noriad play bar. It begins, I went weeping to the world searching for wonders. Perhaps you're familiar with it? I'd like nothing better than to discuss the Noriad play bar with you, Griff, Scotty called back. Would you let me come aboard, though, first? Overjoyed at being on a ship bound for any port at all, Scotty was true to his word. For an hour, as the boat rolled down the river past the blackened remnants of Bosmer villages, he asked no questions and spoke nothing of his life over the past weeks. He merely listened of Malone's theories of Merethical Mirror and Soterica. The translator was undemanding of his guest's scholarship, accepting nods and shrugs as civilized conversation. He even produced some wine and fish jelly, which he shared with Scotty absent-mindedly as he expounded his various theses. Finally, while Malone was searching for a reference to some minor point in his notes, Scotty asked, rather off subject, but I was wondering where we bound. The very heart of the province, Sylvanar, Malone said, not looking up from the passage he was reading. It's somewhat bothersome, actually, as I wanted to go to Woodhearth first to talk to a Bosmer there who claims to have an original copy of Tirith Yamiliad, if you can believe it. But for the time being, that has to wait. Somerset Isle has surrounded the city and is in the process of starving the citizenry until they surrender. It's a tiresome prospect since the Bosmer are happy to eat one another, so there is a risk that at the end only one fat wood elf will remain to wave the flag. That is a fact, agreed Scotty sympathetically. To the east the Khajiit are burning everything, and to the west the High Elves are waging war. I don't suppose the borders to the north are clear. They're even worse, replied Malone, finger on the page, still distracted. If Cyrodiils and Redguards don't want Bosmer refugees streaming into their provinces, it only stands to reason. I imagine how much more criminally inclined they'd be now that they're homeless and hungry. So, murmured Scotty, feeling a shiver, we're trapped in Valenwood. Not at all. I need to leave fairly shortly myself, as my publisher has set a very definite deadline for my new book of translations. From what I understand, one merely petitions to the Sylvanar for special border protection, and one can cross into Cyrodiil with impunity. Petition the Sylvanar or petition at Sylvanar. Petition the Sylvanar at Sylvanar. It's not nomenclature that is typical of this place, the sort of thing that makes my job as a translator that much more challenging. The Sylvanar, he, or rather they, are the closest the Bosmer have to a great leader. The essential thing to remember about the Sylvanar, Malone smiled, finding the passage he was looking for. Here, a fortnight inexplicable, the world burst into dance. There's that metaphor again. What were you saying about the Sylvanar? Asked Scotty. The essential thing to remember? I don't remember what I was saying, replied Malone, turning back to his oration. In a week's time, the little boat bumped along the shallow, calmer waters to the foaming current with Zillow had become, and Decimos Scotty first saw the city of Sylvanar. If Falinesti was a tree, then Sylvanar was a flower, a magnificent pile of faded shades of green, red, blue and white, shining with crystalline residue. Malone had mentioned offhand, when not otherwise explaining Aldmeri prosody, that Sylvanar had once been a blossoming glade in the forest, but owing to some spell or natural cause, the tree sap began flowing with translucent liquor. The process of the sap flowing and hardening over the colorful trees had formed the web of the city. Malone's description was intriguing, but it hardly prepared him for the city's beauty. What is the finest, most luxurious tavern here? Scotty asked one of the Bosmer boatmen. Brithala Hall, Malone answered. But why don't you stay with me? I'm visiting an acquaintance of mine, a scholar I think you'll find fascinating. His hovel isn't much, but he has the most extraordinary ideas about the principles of Merethical Mirror tribe, the Sarmathi. Under any other circumstances I would happily accept, said Scotty graciously, but after weeks of sleeping on the ground or on a raft and eating whatever I could scrounge, I feel the need for some indulgent creature comforts, and then after a day or two I'm I'll petition the Sylvanar for a safe passage to Cyrodiil. The men bade each other goodbye. Griff Mellon gave him the address of his publisher in the Imperial City, which Scotty accepted and quickly forgot. The clerk wandered the streets of Sylvanar, crossing bridges of amber, admiring the petrified forest architecture. In front of a particular estimable palace of silver and reflective crystal, he found Prithala Hall. He took the finest room and ordered a gluttonous meal of the finest quality. At nearby table he saw two very fat fellows, a man and a Bosmer, remarking how much finer the food was there than at the Sylvanar's palace. They began to discuss the war and some issues of finances and rebuilding provincial bridges. The man noticed Scotty looking at them, and his eyes flashed recognition. "Scotty, is that you? Kinnereth, where have you been? I've had to make all the contracts here on my own." At the sound of his voice, Scotty recognized him. The fat man was Leodas Juras, vastly engorged. Two more books, alright. Dance and Fire, Chapter 6, by Wei Hinjarth. Taking Scotty sat down, listening to Leodas Juras. The clerk could hardly believe how fat his former colleague at Lord Etchia's building commission had become. The piquant aroma of the roasted meat dish before Scotty melted away. All the other sounds and textures of Prithala Hall vanished all around him, as if nothing else existed but the vast form of Juras. Scotty did not consider himself an emotional man, but he felt a tide flow over him at the sight and sound of the man whose badly written letters had been the guidepost that carried him from the Imperial City back in the early frostfall. "Where have you been?" Juras demanded again. "I told you to meet me in Falanest weeks ago. I was 3 weeks ago." Scotty stammered, too surprised to be indignant. "I got your note to meet you in Athay, so I went there, but the Khajiit had burned it to the ground. Somehow I found my way with the refugees in another village, and someone there told me that you had been killed." "And you believed that right away?" Juras sneered. "The fellow seemed very well informed about you. He was a clerk from Lord Vanek's building commission named Reglius, and he said that you had also suggested that he come down to Valenwood to profit from the war." "Oh yes," said Juras after thinking a moment. "I recall the name now. Well, it's good for business to have two representatives from Imperial building commissions here. We just need to all coordinate our bids, and all should be well." "Reglius is dead," says Scotty, "but I have his contracts from Lord Vanek's commission." "Even better," gasped Juras, impressed. "I never knew you were such a ruthless competitor, Decimus Scotty. Yes, this could certainly improve our position with the Sylvanar. Have I introduced you to Bast here?" Scotty had only been dimly aware of the Bosmer's presence at the table with Juras, which was surprising given that the mer's girth nearly equaled his dining companion. The clerk nodded to Bast coldly, still numb and confused. It had not left his mind that only an hour earlier Scotty had intended to petition the Sylvanar for safe passage through the border back to Cyrodiil. The thought of doing business with Juras after all, of profiting from Valenwood war with elsewhere, and now the second one with the Somerset Isle, seemed like something happening to another person. Most goated RPG streamer. Let's see me streaming. "Hey Emperor Roma, welcome to my stream." Yeah, I'm still reading the lore here. There's left this book, as far as I can remember, yet another, and 3 more, and we're done. And we're done with Skyrim. "Your colleague and I were talking about the Sylvanar," said Bath, putting down the leg of mutton he had been gnawing on. "You started following me on Old Oblivion Run. You like how I read all the books and stuff." "Yeah, I try to at least understand what happens around, or maybe even to progress further." "You learn more about the world of Tamriel through these streams than when you play the games yourself." "Well, I'm trying to do my best." I've been reading for 2.5 hours for tonight's stream, but I hope to read all these books, and finally the Skyrim chapter of my life will be over. Alright. Let's take a sip of tea. Thank you for watching, bro. Hope that you have a good night's rest and sweet dreams to you. Good night, bro. Alright, let's proceed with reading. Let's start this. Let's start this part yet again. Your colleague and I were talking about the Sylvanar, said Baths, putting down the leg of mutton he had been gnawing on. I don't suppose you've heard about his nature. A little, but nothing very specific. I got the impression that he's very important and very peculiar. He's the representative of the people, legally, physically, and emotionally, explained Juras, a little annoyed at his new partner's lack of common knowledge. When they're healthy, so is he. When they're mostly female, so is he. When they cry for food or trade or an absence of foreign interference, he feels it too, and makes laws accordingly. In a way, he's a despot, but he's the people's despot. That sounds, said Scott, searching for the appropriate word, like bunk. Perhaps it is, shrugged Bast, but he has many rights as the voice of the people, including the granting of foreign building and trade contracts. It's not important whether you believe us, just think of the Sylvanar as being like one of your mad emperors, like Pelagius. The problem facing us now is that since Valenwood is being attacked on all sides, the Sylvanar's aspect is now one of distrust and fear of foreigners. The one hope of his people, and thus of the Sylvanar himself, is that the Emperor will intervene and stop the war. Will he? Asked Scotty. You know as well as we do that the Emperor has not been himself lately. Juras helped himself to Regulus' satchel and pulled out the blank contracts. Who knows what he'll choose to do or not to do? That reality is not our concern, but these blessings from the late good Sir Regulus make our job much simpler. They discussed how they would represent themselves to the Sylvanar into the evening. Scotty ate continuously, but not nearly as much as Juras and Baths. When the sun had begun to rise in the hills, it slid reddened through the crystal walls of the tavern. Juras and Baths left to their rooms at the palace, granted to their diplomatically in lieu of an actual immediate audience with the Sylvanar. Scotty went to his room. He thought about staying up a little longer to ruminate over Juras' plans and see what might be the flaw in them, but upon touching the cool soft bed he immediately fell asleep. The next afternoon Scotty awoke, feeling himself again. In other words, timid. For several weeks now he had been a creature bent on mere survival. He had been driven to exhaustion, attacked by several jungle beasts, starved, nearly drowned, and forced into discussions of ancient Aldmeri poetical works. The discussion he had with Juras and Baths about how to dupe the Sylvanar into signing their contracts seemed perfectly reasonable then. Scotty dressed himself in his old battered clothes and went downstairs in search of food and peaceful place to think. "You're up," cried Baths upon seeing him. "We should go to the palace now." "Now?" whined Scotty. "Look at me, I need new clothes. This isn't the way one should dress to pay a call on a prostitute, let alone the voice of the people of Valenwood. I haven't even bathed. You must cease from this moment from forward being a clerk and become a student of mercantile trade," said Ludius Juras grandly, taking Scotty by the arm and leading him into the sunlit boulevard outside. "The first rule is to recognize what you represent to the prospective client and what angle best suits you. You cannot dazzle him with opulent fashion and professional bearing, my dear boy, and it would be fatal if you attempted to. Trust me on this. Several others besides Baths and I are guests at the palace, and they have made the error of appearing too eager, too formal, too ready for business. They will never be granted audience with the Sylvanar, but we have remained aloof ever since the initial rejection. I've dallied about the court, spread my knowledge of life in the imperial city, had my ears pierced, attended promenades, eaten and drunk of all that was given to me. I dare say I've put on a pound or two. The message we've sent is clear. It is in his, not our, best interest to meet. Our plan worked, added Balth, when I told his minister that our imperial representative had arrived and that we were at last willing to meet with the Sylvanar this morning. We were told to bring you there straight away. Aren't we late then? Asked Scotty. Very, laughed Juras, but that's again part of the angle we're representing. Benevolent disinterest. Remember not to confuse the Sylvanar with conventional nobility. His is the mind of the common people. When you grasp that, you'll understand how to manipulate him. Juras spent the last several minutes of the walk through the city expounding his theories about what Valenwood needed, how much, and at what price. There were staggering figures for far more construction and far higher costs than anything Scotty had been used to dealing with. He listened carefully. All around them the city of Sylvanar revealed itself, glass and flower, roaring winds and beautiful inertia. When they reached the palace of the Sylvanar, Decimus Scotty stopped stunned. Juras looked at him for a moment and then laughed. It's quite bizarre, isn't it? That it was. A frozen scarlet burst of twisted, uneven spires as if a rival sun rising. A blossom the size of a village, where courtiers and servants resembled nothing so much as insects walked about it sucking its ichor. Entering over a bent petal-like bridge, the three walked through the palace of unbalanced walls. Where the partitions bent close together and touched, there was a shaded hall or a smaller chamber. Where they warped away from one another, there was a courtyard. There were no doors anywhere, no any way to get to the Sylvanar but by crossing through the entire spiral of the palace, through meetings and bedrooms and dining halls, past dignitaries, consorts, musicians, and many guards. It's an interesting place, said Balth, but not very much privacy. Of course, that suits the Sylvanar well. When they reached the inner corridors, 2 hours after they first entered the palace, guards, brandishing blades and bows, stopped them. We have an audience with the Sylvanar, said Juras patiently. This is Lord Decimus Scotty, the imperial representative. One of the guards disappearing down the winding corridor and returned moments later with a tall, proud Mosmer clad in a loose robe of patchwork leather. He was the Minister of Trade. The Sylvanar wishes to speak with Lord Decimus Scotty alone. It was not the place to argue or show fear, so Scotty stepped forward, not even looking towards Juras and Balth. He was certain they were showing their masks of benevolent indifference. Following the minister into the audience chamber, Scotty recited to himself all the facts and figures Juras had presented to him. He willed himself to remember the angle and the image he must project. The audience chamber of the Sylvanar was an enormous dome, with the walls bent from bowl-shaped at the base inward to almost meet at the top. A thin ray of sunlight streamed through the fissure hundreds of feet above and directly upon the Sylvanar, who stood upon a puff of shimmering grey powder. For all the wonder in the city and the palace, the Sylvanar himself looked perfectly ordinary. An average bland, the handsome, slightly tired-looking, extraordinary wood elf of the type one might see in the capital in the Empire. It was only when he stepped from the dais that Scotty noticed an eccentricity in his appearance. He was very short. I had to speak with you alone, said the Sylvanar, in a voice common and unrefined. May I see your papers? Scotty handed him the blank contracts from the Lord Vanek's building commission. The Sylvanar studied them, running his finger over the embossed seal of the Emperor before handing them back. He suddenly seemed shy, looking to the floor. There are many charlatans at my court who wish to benefit from the wars. I thought you and your colleagues were among them, but those contracts are genuine. Yes, they are, said Scotty calmly. The Sylvanar's conventional aspect made it easy for Scotty to speak, with no formal greetings, no deference, exactly as Juras has instructed. It seems more sensible to begin straight away talking about the roads, which need to be rebuilt, and then the harbors that the Altmeric have destroyed, and that I can give you my estimates on the cost of resupplying and renovating the trade routes. Why hadn't the Emperor seen fit to send a representative when the war with Elsewhere began 2 years ago? Asked the Sylvanar glumly. Scotty thought a moment before replying of all the common boss Mary he had met in Valenwood, the greedy, frightened mercenaries who had escorted him from the border, the hard-drinking revelers and expert pests exterminating archers in the western cross of Falinesti, nosy old Mother Pascost in the Havel slump, Captain Balthix, the poor sadly reformed pirate, the terrified but hopeful refugees of Athea and Granos, the mad murderous self-devouring wild hunt of Indici, the silent dour boatman hired by Grief Malon, the degenerate grasping baths. If one creature represented their total disposition and that of many more throughout the province, what would be his personality? Scotty was a clerk by occupation and nature, instinctively comfortable cataloging and filing, making things fit in a system. If the soul of Valenwood were to be filed, where would it be put? The answer came upon him almost before he posed himself the question. Denial. I'm afraid that question doesn't interest me, said Scotty. Now can we get back to the business at hand? All afternoon, Scotty and the Sylvanar discussed the pressing needs of Valenwood. Every contract was filled and signed, so much was required, and there were so many costs associated that addendums and codicils had to be scribbled into the margins of the papers, and those had to be re-signed. Scotty maintained his benevolent indifference, but he found that dealing with the Sylvanar was not quite the same as dealing with a simple, sullen child. The voice of the people knew certain practical, everyday things very well. The yields of fish, the benefits of trade, the condition of every township and forest in his province. We'll have a banquet tomorrow night to celebrate this commission, said the Sylvanar at last. Best make it tonight, replied Scotty. We should leave for Cyrodiil with the contracts tomorrow, so I'll need a safe passage to the border. Best not waste any more time. Agreed, said the Sylvanar, and called for his Minister of Trade to put his seal on the contracts and arrange for the feast. Scotty left the chamber and was greeted by baths and jurors. Their faces showed the strain of maintaining the illusion of unconcern for too many hours. As soon as they were out of sight of the guards, they begged Scotty to tell them all. When he showed them the contract, Bath began weeping with delight. Anything about the Sylvanar that surprised you? Asked Juris. I hadn't expected him to be half my height. Was he? Juris looked mildly surprised. He must have shrunk since I tried to have an audience with him earlier. Maybe there's something to all that nonsense about him being affected by the plight of his people. Alright, the last book, A Dancing Fire, Volume 7, Chapter 7 by Waken Jarth. Scene, Sylvanar, Valenwood, date 13th Sun's Dusk, 3rd year 397. The banquet at the palace of the Sylvanar was well attended by every jealous bureaucrat and trader who had attempted to contract their building of Valenwood. They looked on Decumus Scotty, Lydius Juris, and Baths with undisguised hatred. It made Scotty very uncomfortable, but Juris delighted in it. As the servants brought in platter after platter of roasted meats, Juris poured himself a cup of jaga and toasted the clerk. I can confess now, said Juris, I had grave doubts about inviting you to join me on this adventure. All the other clerks and agents of building commissions I contacted were more outwardly aggressive, but none of them made it through, let alone to the audience chamber of the Sylvanar, let alone brokered the deal on their own like you did. Come, have a cup of jaga with me. No thank you, said Scotty. I had too much of the drug in Falinesti and nearly got sucked dry by a giant tick because of it. I'll find something else to drink. Scotty wandered about the hall until he saw some diplomats drinking mugs of a streaming brown liquid poured from a large silver urn. He asked them if it was tea. Tea made from leaves? Scoffed the first diplomat. Not in Valenwood. This is rotmeth. Scotty poured himself a mug and took a tentative sip. It was gamey, bitter and sugared, and very salty. At first it seemed very disagreeable to his palate, but a moment later he found he had drained the mug and was pouring another. His body tingled, and all the sounds in the chamber seemed oddly disjointed, but not frighteningly so. "Sir, you're the fellow who got the Sylvanar to sign all these contracts," said the second diplomat. "That must have required some deep negotiation. Not at all, not at all, just a little basic understanding of mercantile trading, grinned Scotty, pouring himself a third mug of rot meth. The Sylvanar was very eager to involve the Imperial State with the affairs of Valenwood. I was very eager to take a percentage of the commission. With all that blessed eagerness, it was merely a matter of putting quill to contract, bless you. You have been in the employ of His Imperial Majesty very long, asked the first diplomat. It's a bit, or rather a bit, more complicated than that in the Imperial City. Between you and me, I don't really have a job. I used to work for Lord Atreus and his building commission, but I got sacked. And then the contracts are from Lord Vanek and his building commission, cause I got them from this fellow Reglius, who is a competitor but still a very fine fellow until he was made dead by those Khajiiti. Scotty drank his fifth mug. When I go back to the Imperial City, then the real negotiations can begin, bless you. I can go to my old employer and to Lord Vanek and say, look here, you, which one of you wants these commissions? And they'll all fall over each other to take them from me. It will be bidding war for my percentage, the likes of which no one nowhere has never seen. So you're not a representative of His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor, asked the first diplomat. Didn't you hear what I said, you stupid? Scotty felt a surge of rage, which quickly subsided. He chuckled and poured himself a seventh mug. The building commissions are privately owned, but they're still representatives of the Emperor. So I'm a representative of the Emperor, or I will be, when I get these contracts in. It's very complicated. I can understand why you're not following me. Bless you, it's like the poet said, a dance and fire, and if you follow the illusion, that is to say illusion. And your colleagues, are they representatives of the Emperor? Asked the second diplomat. Scotty burst into laughter, shaking his head. The diplomats bade him respect and went to talk to the minister. Scotty stumbled out of the palace and reeled through the strange, organic avenues and boulevards of the city. It took him several hours to find his way to Prithala Hall and his room. Once there, he slept very nearly on his bed. The next morning, he woke to Juras and Baths in his room shaking him. He felt half asleep and unable to open his eyes fully, but otherwise fine. The conversation with the diplomats floated in his mind in the haze like an obscure childhood memory. What in Mara's name is rotmeth? He asked quickly. Rancid, strongly fermented meat juices with lots of spices to kill the poisons, smiled Baths. I should have warned you to stay with Jaga. You must understand the meat mandate by now, laughed Juras. This boss Mary would rather eat each other than touch the fruit of the vine or the field. What did I say to those diplomats? Cried Scotty, panicking. Nothing bad, apparently, said Juras, pulling out some papers. Your escorts are downstairs to bring you to the Imperial Province. Here are your papers of safe passage. The Sylvanar seems very impatient about business proceeding forward rapidly. He promises to send you some sort of rare treasure when the contracts are fulfilled. See, he's already given me something. Juras showed off his new bejeweled earring, a beautiful large-faced ruby. Bath shows that he had a similar one. The two fat fellows left their room so Scotty could dress and pack. A full regiment of the Sylvanar's guards was on the street in front of the tavern. They surrounded the carriage, crested with the official arms of Valenwood. Still there, Scotty climbed in and gave Captain the guard gave the signal. They began a quick gallop. Scotty shook himself and then peered behind. Baths and Juras were waving him goodbye. Wait, Scotty cried. Aren't you coming back to the Imperial Province too? The Sylvanar asked that we stay behind as Imperial representatives, yelled Leodas Juras. In case there is a need for more contracts and negotiations, he's appointed us undrape, some sort of special honor for foreigners at court. Don't worry, lots of banquets to attend. You can handle the negotiations with Vanek and Atreus yourself, and we'll keep things settled here. Juras continued to yell advice about business, but his voice became indistinct with distance. Soon it disappeared altogether as the convoy rounded the streets of Sylvanar. The jungle loomed suddenly, and then they were in it. Scotty had only gone through it by foot or along the rivers by slow-moving boats. Night flashed all around him in profusions of greens. The horses seemed even faster moving through underbrush than on the smooth paths of the city. None of the weird sounds or dank smells of the jungle penetrated the escort. It felt to Scotty as if he were watching a play about the jungle with a background of a quickly moving screen which offered only the merest suggestion of the place. So it went for 2 weeks. There was lots of food and water in the carriage with the clerk, and so he merely ate and slept as the caravan pressed endlessly on. From time to time he'd hear the sound of blades clashing, but when he looked around, whatever had attacked the caravan had long since been left behind. At last they reached the border, where an imperial garrison was stationed. Scotty presented the soldiers who met the carriage with the papers. They asked him a barrage of questions that he answered monosyllabically, and then let him pass. It took several more days to arrive at the gates of the imperial city. The horses that had flown so fast through the jungle now slowed down in the unfamiliar territory of the wooded Colovian estates. By contrast, the cries of his province's birds and smells of his province's plant life brought Decimus Scotty alive. It was as if he had been dreaming of the past months. At the gates of the city, Scotty's carriage door was opened for him, and he stepped out on uncertain legs. Before he had a moment to say something to the escort, they had vanished, galloping back south through the forest. The first thing he did now that he was home was go to the closest tavern, have tea and fruit and bread. If he never ate meat again, he told himself that it would suit him very nicely. Negotiations with Lord Atreus and Lord Vanek proceeded immediately thereafter. It was most agreeable. Both commissions recognized how lucrative the rebuilding of Valenwood would be for their agency. Lord Vanek claimed quite justifiably that as the contracts had been written on forms notarized by his commission, he had the legal right to them. Lord Atreus claimed that Decimus Scotty was his agent and representative, and that he had never been released from employment. The Emperor was called to arbitrate, but he claimed to be unavailable. His advisor, the Imperial battle mage Jagar Tharn, had disappeared long ago and could not be called on for his wisdom and impartial mediation. Scotty lived very comfortably off the bribes from Lord Atreus and Lord Vanek. Every week a letter would arrive from Juras or Beths asking about the status of negotiations. Gradually these letters ceased coming, and more urgent ones came from the Minister of Trade and the Sylvanar himself. The War of the Blue Divide with Somerset Isle ended with Altmere winning several new coastal islands from the Wood Elves. The war with Elsewhere continued, ravaging the eastern borders of Valenwood. Still, Vanek and Atreus fought over who would help. One fine morning, in the early spring of the year 398, a courier arrived at Decimus Scotty's door. Lord Vanek has won the Valenwood Commission and requests that you and the contracts come to his hall at your earliest convenience. Has Lord Atreus decided not to challenge further? Asked Scotty. He's been unable to, having died very suddenly, just now from a terribly unfortunate accident, said the courier. Scotty had wondered how long it would be before the Dark Brotherhood was brought in for final negotiations. As he walked toward Lord Vanek's building commission, a long severe piece of architecture on a minor but respectable plaza, he wondered if he had played the game as he ought to have. Could Vanek be so rapacious as to offer him a lower percentage of the commission now that his chief competitor was dead? Thankfully he discovered Lord Vanek had already decided to pay Scotty what he had proposed during the heat of the winter negotiations. His advisors had explained to him that other lesser building commissions might come forward unless the matter were handled quickly and fairly. Glad we have all the legal issues done with, said Lord Vanek fondly. Now we can get to the business of helping the poor boss marry and collecting the profits. It's pity you weren't our representative for all the troubles with Bendermark and the Arnisan business. But there will be plenty more wars, I'm sure of that. Scotty and Lord Vanek sent word to the Sylvanar that at last they were prepared to honor the contracts. A few weeks later they held a banquet in honor of the profitable enterprise. Decimus Scotty was the darling of the imperial city, and no expense was spared to make it an unforgettable evening. As Scotty met the nobles and the wealthy merchants who would be benefiting from his business dealings, an exotic but somehow faintly familiar smell rose in the ballroom. It traced it to its source, a thick roasted slab of meat, so long and thick it covered several platters. The sturdy revelers were eating ravenously, unable to find the words to express their delight as it taste and texture. Wait a bit, please. It's like nothing I've ever had before. It's like a pig fat venison. Do you see the marbling of fattened meat? It's a masterpiece. Scotty went to take a slice, but then he saw something embedded deep in the dried and rendered roast. He nearly collided with his new employer, Lord Vanek, as he stumbled back. Where did this come from? Scotty stammered. From our client, the Sylvanar. He beamed his lordship, some kind of local delicacy they call unthrapa. Scotty vomited and didn't stop for some time. It cast rather a temporary pall on the evening, but when Decimo Scotty was carried off to his manor house, the guests continued to dine. The unthrapa was the delight of all, even more so when Lord Vanek himself took a slice and found the first or two rubies buried within. How very clever of the Bosmer to invent such a dish, the Cyrodiils agreed. Alright, these are done. I didn't find the Karwich Koninge Volume 1, so let's read from Volume 2. Third Last Seed, Third Era 411, Telarun, Morrowind. My good friend Charwich, I only just last week received your letter dated 6 Suns Hide addressed to me in Sadrith Mora. I did not know how to reach you before to tell you of my progress finding Hadwaf Nathwir, so I sent this to you now, care of the lady you mentioned in your letter, the Lady Elizabeth Moorling of Wayrest. I hope that if you have left her palace, she will know where you've gone and can send this to you, and I hope further that you receive it in a timelier manner than I received your letter. It is essential that I hear from you soon so we may coordinate our next course of action. My adventures here have 2 acts, one before I received your letter and one immediately after. While you searched for the elusive possessor of Azura Star in his homeland to the west, I searched for him where we understood he conjured up the Daedra Prince and received from her the artifact. Like you, I had little difficulty finding people who had heard of or even knew Nathwir. In fact, not long after we parted company and you left for the Iliac Bay, I met someone who knew where he went to perform the ceremony, so I left at once to come here to Telarun. It took some time to locate my contact, for he is a dissident priest named Minirath. The Temple and Tribunal, the real powers of Morrowind, tend to frown on his order, and while they haven't begun so much of crusade to stamp them out, there are certainly rumors that they will soon. This tends to make priests like Minirath skittish and paranoid, difficult people to set appointments with. Finally, I was told that he would be willing to talk to me at the Plot and Plaster, a tiny tavern without even a room to rent. Downstairs there were several cloaked men crammed around the tavern's only table, and they searched me to see if I had any weaponry. Of course I hadn't. You know that isn't my preferred method of doing business. When I decided that I was harmless, one of the cloaked figures revealed himself to be Minirath. I paid him the gold I promised and asked him what he knew about Hadwaf Nathwir. He remembered him well enough, saying that after he received the star, the lad intended to return to High Rock. It seemed he had unfinished business there, presumably of a violent nature, which Azura Star would facilitate. He had no other information, and I did not know what else to ask. We parted company, and I waited for your letter, hoping you had found Nathwir and perhaps even the star. I confess that as I lingered in Morrowind and never heard from you, I began to have doubts about your character. You'll forgive me for saying so, but I began to fear that you had taken the artifact for yourself. In fact, I was making plans to come to High Rock myself when your letter came at last. The tale of your adventure in the cemetery at Grimtree Garden and the information you gathered from the lycanthropic caretaker inspired me to have another meeting with Minirath. Thus began the second act of my story. I returned to the pot and plaster, reasoning that the priests must frequent that area of the city to feel so comfortable setting clandestine meetings there. It took some time searching, but I finally found him, and as luck would have it, he was alone. I called his name and he quickly drew me to a dark alleyway, nervous that we would be seen by a temple ordinator. It is a rare and beautiful thing when a victim insists on dragging his killer to a remote location. I began at once asking about his fellow you mentioned, Nethwyr's mysterious patron, Baliazir. He denied ever heard David. He denied ever having heard the name. We were still in that easy, fairly conversational state when I attacked the priest. Of course, he was completely taken by surprise. In some ways, that can be more effective than an ambush from behind. No matter how many times I've done it, no one ever expected that friendly man they're talking to grip them by the neck. I pressed hard against my favorite spot in the soft part of the throat, just below the thyroid cartilage, and it took him too long to react to my lunge and try pushing back. He began to lose consciousness, and I whispered that if I released my grip a little so he could talk and breathe, but he tried to call for help, I would snap his neck. He nodded, and I relaxed the pressure, just a bit. I asked him again about Baliazir, and he shook his head, insisting that he had never heard the name. As frightened as he was, it seemed most likely that he was telling the truth, so I asked him more generally if he knew anyone else who might know something about Hadwaf Nethwyr. He told me that there was a woman presently also during the ceremony, someone he introduced as his sister. I remembered that then the part of your letter about seeing the grave of Nethwyr's sister, Perira. And I mentioned the name to the priest. He nodded frantically, and I could see that the interrogation had reached an ending. There is, after all, something about being throttled that causes the man to answer yes to every question. I snagged Minrath's neck and returned home. So now I'm again unsure how to proceed. I have made several more inquiries, and several of the same people who met Nethwyr remember him being with a woman. A few recall him saying that she was his sister. One or two believe they remember her name as being Perira, though they're not certain. No one, however, has heard of anyone named Baliazir. If I do not hear words from you in response to this in the next couple of weeks, I will come to High Rock, because it's there that most people believe Nethwyr returned. I will only stay here long enough to see if there are other inquiries I can make only in Morrowind to bring us closer to our goal of recovering Azura's star. Your friend, Koninge. Alright, I need yet another pause, because I'm out of tea again. And then we may proceed. Wait, please wait a bit. Alright, here we go. Karwich Koninge Letters, Volume 3. 13th last seed, third year of 411. Wayrest, High Rock. My dear Koninge, please forgive the quality of the handwriting on this note, but I have not long to live. I can only reply in detail to one part of your letter, and that is that I hear I fear Baliazir, contrary to what you've heard, is very much real. Had he been but a figment of that caretaker's imagination, I would not be feeling like life ebbed from me as I write this. Lady Morling has sent for healers, but I know they won't arrive in time. I just need to explain what happened so that you'll understand, and then all my affairs in this world will be ended. The one advantage of my condition is that I must be brief, without my habitually ornamental descriptions of people and places. I know that you will appreciate that at least. It started when I came to Wayrest, and through my friend Lady Morling and her court connections, was introduced to Baliazir himself. I had to proceed carefully, not wanting him to know of our designs on Azura's star, which I presumed he possessed, given to him by his servant Hadwife Nathware. His function in Queen Elisana's court seemed to be decorative, like so many of her courtiers, and it was not hard to differentiate myself from the others when we began conversing on the School of Mysticism. Many of the others hangers-on at the palace can speak eloquently on the subject of the magical arts, but it seems that only he and I had deep knowledge of the craft. Many noblemen or adventurers who aren't mages by profession learn a spell or two from the useful schools of restoration or destruction. I told Baliazir quite truthfully that I had never learned any of that. Oh, but I wish I knew some healing spells of the School of Restoration now. But that I had developed some small skill in mysticism, not enough to be a psychic, of course, but in telekinesis, password, and spell reflection I had some amateur ability. He responded with compliments, which allowed me to seg into the topic of another spell of mysticism, the Soul Trap. I told him I was unlearned but curious about that spell, and very naturally and comfortably I was able to bring up the subject of Azura's star, the endless well of souls. Imagine how I had to hold back my excitement when he leaned in and whispered to me, "If that interests you, come to Clithic's cairn west of the city tomorrow night." I couldn't sleep at all. The only thing I could think of was how I would get the star when he showed it to me. I still knew so little about Baliazir, his past and his power, but the opportunity was too great to let pass. Still, I must admit that I held hopes that you would arrive, as you threatened you might in your letter, so I might have someone of physical strength to aid me in my adventure. I'm growing weaker and weaker as I write this, so I must proceed with the basic facts. I went to the crypt the following night, and Baliazir led me through the maze of it to the repository where he kept the star. We were taking quite casually, and as you've so often said, it seemed an excellent time for an ambush. I grabbed the star and unsheathed my blade in what I felt was amazing speed. It turned to me, and I suddenly felt that I was moving like a snail. In a flash, Baliazir changed his form and became his true self, not man or mer, but Daedra, a colossal Daedra lord who swiped back the star from my grasp and left my sword as it thudded against his impenetrable hide. I knew I had been beaten, and I threw myself towards the corridor. A blue flash of energy coursed through me, flung by Baliazir's claws. At once I began to feel death. He could have smote me with 1,000 spells, but he chose the one where I could lie down and suffer and hear him laugh. At the very least, I did not give him that pleasure. Already struck, it was too late for me to cast a counterspell of mysticism, one to dispel the magicka, reflect it or absorb it as my own. But I did still know how to teleport myself, about Mystic's term recall, to whatever place I'd last set a spiritual anchor. I confess that at the time I didn't remember where that would be, perhaps in Borean when I arrived in the Iliac Bay, or in Cambria, or in Grimmature Garden, where I met the caretaker, or my hostess's palace in Wayrest. I pray that I had not set the anchor last when I was with you in Morrowind, where it said that if the distance is too great one can be caught between dimensions. Still, I was willing to take that chance, rather than being the plaything of Baliazir. I cast the spell and found myself back in the doorstep of Lady Morling's palace. To be out of the crypt and away from Daedra was a relief, but I had so hoped that I had been smart enough to cast an anchor near a mage's guild or a temple where I could find a healer. Instead, knowing I was too weak to walk far, I beat on the door and was taken here where I write this letter, lying in my bed. As I wrote those words, dear Elizabeth, Lady Morling came in quite tearfully and frantic to tell me the healer should be here within a few minutes. But I will be dead here they arrive. I know these are my last words, dear friend. Stay away from this cursed place. Your friend, Charwich. Charwich Coninga Letters, Book 4. 8th Sun's Dawn, 3rd era, 412. Emiglith, Somerset Isle. My good friend, Lord Gammon, you must forgive me for not meeting you at the palace personally, but I have been unavoidably tragically detained. I have left the front gate and door unlocked, and if you're reading this, you must have made it at least as far as the antechamber to the east drawing room. Perhaps you have already wandered the estate and some of its delights before coming to this chamber. The 7 fountains of marble and porphyry, the reflected pool, the various groves, the colonnades and quincunx. I don't think you would have already gone to the second floor suites and the west wing, as you would have had to pass this room first and pick up this ladder, but believe me, they are beautifully appointed with magnificent balustrades, winding staircases, intimate silence and bedchambers worthy of your affluence. The price of this property is exorbitant, certainly, but for a man like you who seeks only the best, this is the villa you must have. As you undoubtedly notice as you arrive through the gates, there are several smaller buildings ideally suited to be guard stations. I know you are concerned with security. I'm an intensely greedy man, and there is nothing I would have liked more than to meet you here today, show you the grounds, fawn on you obsequiously, and collect a fat percentage of the cost of the sale when you bought this marvelous palace, as I'm sure you would have. My dilemma that caused my inexcusable absence began shortly after I arrived here early to make certain the villa was well cleaned for your inspection. A man named Coninga crept up behind me and gripped me by the throat, clapping his left hand over my mouth and nose and throttling me with his right hand, crushing the soft spot on my throat just below the thyroidal cartilage. He effectively strangled me in a few quick but very painful minutes. I'm currently buried in a pile of leaves in the north statuary parterre, close to the exceptional sculpture representation of the transformation of Trinamac. It should not be too long before I'm discovered. Someone at my bank will surely notice my absence in due time. Coninga might have buried me deeper, but he wanted me to be ready for the arrival of his old partner, Carwich. Perhaps part of you thinks it best to stop reading now, Lord Gammon. You are looking around the antechamber and seeing nothing but doors. The large one you took to come in from the garden is locked now behind you, and without a better knowledge of the layout of the estate, I could not recommend you attempt to flee down a corridor that might easily come to a dead end. No, much better to keep reading and see where this is going. Coninga, it seems, was in a partnership with his friend Charwich to try to recover Azura Star. They understood it to be in the possession of someone named Hadwaf Nathwir, a man who conjured up the Daedra Prince Azura herself to acquire it. As Nathwir originally hailed from High Rock, Charwich went there to look for him, while his partner searched Morrowind. They planned to communicate their findings by letters sent through couriers. Charwich's first letter stated that he had found information that Nathwir had a mysterious patron named Balaizir, a fact he had learned at a cemetery, the gravestone of Nathwir's sister Perira and the lycanthropic caretaker. Coninga replied back that he could find nothing about Balaizir, but believed that Nathwir had returned to High Rock with Perira after getting the star. Charwich's last letter was written on his deathbed, having sustained mortal wounds from his battle with Balaizir, who it seemed had been a mighty Daedra lord. Coninga grieved for his friend and travelled the span of the Empire to Wayrest to pay his call of condolences on Lady Morling, the woman at whose house Charwich had been staying. After making some inquiries, Coninga learned that her ladyship had left the city quite suddenly. She had been entertaining a guest named Charwich, and it was understood that he had died, though no one ever saw the body. Certainly no healers had been sent to her house on the 13th of the last seed of last year, and no one in Weyres, just like no one in Tel Arun, had ever heard of Meliazir. Poor Kaninge was suddenly unsure of everything. He retraced his late partner's path through Boreane and Grimtry gardens, but found that Nathwir family crypt was elsewhere in a small town in the barony of Dwinnen. There was indeed a lycanthropic caretaker, fortunately in human form at the time. When questioned using the technique of strangulation release, he told Kaninge the story that he had told Carwich many months before. Hadwaf and Perura Nathwir had returned to Dwinnen, intent on setting on business. As the star requires potent spirits for power, they thought they would begin small by capturing the spirit of the werewolf they knew of in the family graveyard. Sadly for them, their grubs exceeded their reach. When the poor caretaker resumed his human form one morning, he found himself lying next to the shredded, bloody bodies of the Nathwir siblings. Distressed and fearful, he brought the corpses and all their possessions down into the crypt. They were still there when Charwich came, and so too was Azura Star. Koningo now saw things clearly. The letters he had received from Charwich were lies intended to keep him away. Undoubtedly, with the assistance of Lady Moorling, his new partner, he had concocted stories, including one of his own demise, to trick Koninge into abandoning the quest for the star. It was clearly a sad statement of the nature of friendship, and one that needed immediate correction. It took the better part of 6 months for Koninge to find his old partner. Charwish and Lady Moorling had used the power of the stars to make themselves very wealthy and powerful. They assumed a number of different identities in their travels through High Rock and Skyrim, and then down to Valenwood and the Somerset Isle. Along the way, of course, the star itself disappeared, as great Daedric artifacts always do. The couple still had much wealth, but their love sadly fell on troubled times. When they reached Alinor, they parted ways. One must assume that during their months together, Charwish must have told Lady Moorling about Koninge. It's pleasant to think of the loving couple laughing over the stories that were telling him about the mythical and dangerous Baliazir. Charwish must not have given his former beloved a very accurate physical description, however, because when Lady Moorling, then under the identity of the Countess Ziliana, met Koninge, she had no idea who he was. It came as quite a surprise to her when he began strangling her and requesting information about her former paramour. Before she died, she told Koninge what Charwish's new name and title was, and where he was looking for a new palace. She even told him about me. Given all the twists and events the last months Chase took him on, it was not difficult to find which palace Charwich was looking to buy and what time his appointment was to view it. Then he had merely to arrive early, dispose of me, and wait. There our story must sadly end. I look forward to seeing you soon. Yours, Cyrix Goenithi, former estate banker. P.S. Charwich, turn around or don't. Your choice. Your friend, Koninge. Alright, only cleansing the Fane left. The Chronicles of the Holy Brothers of Maru, Volume 4, of the Cleansing of the Fane. Editor's note: this is the only surviving fragment of the chronicle of this first era sect of the Alessian Order. It seems to have been kept at their great monastic complex at Lake Canilus, which was raised during the War of Righteousness, First Era 23-21, and its archives destroyed or dispersed. Note also that Alessian scribes of this time customarily dated events from the apotheosis of Alessia, First Era 266. Here is recorded the events for the year 127 of the Blessed Alessia. This year was the day darkened over all lands, and the sun was all, as it were, master, but 3 days old, and the stars about him at midday. This was on the 5th of first seed. All who saw it were dismayed, and said that a great event should come hereafter. So it did. After the same year issued forth a great concourse of devils from the ancient elvish temple Malada, such had not been seen since the days of King Bilharsa. These devils greatly afflicted the land, such that no man could plough, or reap, or seed, and the people appealed to the brothers of Maru for succor. And then Abbot Cosmas gathered all the brothers and led them to Malada, also known as the High Fane in the Elvish tongue, and came against it with holy fire, and the foul demons were destroyed, and many devilish relics and books found therein were burned, and the land had peace for many years. Oh yes! Yes! We've read all the books my character had in possession, meaning that I've read everything that I've found. And that, my dear viewers, concludes the stream for tonight. I thank you everyone for watching. Hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. I wish you good night, sweet dreams, and let's raid somebody. As tonight, we're going to raid. Let's see who's online. It's rather late, so there won't be much of a choice. Yeah, there's this Successfully Lost, a streamer. She's a good lady. She streams right now The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. She's a fun to watch, so let's raid her. I hope you'll enjoy. See you around. Bye.